June 5th, 2019. And this working session of the State Board of Ed will come to order. Someone's telling us, oh, INS, we have a quorum. The roll call, I'm asking a call to determine the presence of the quorum.
Madam President, with 5 members, you have quorum.
Okay, thank you. The quorum has been determined, and before the State Board proceeds with its agenda, I would ask unanimous consent for our Ward 6 representative to participate in the meeting by phone. Any objection? Okay. Seeing none, we will continue with our agenda. I think into me, with the leadership report. Let me just say a few things, and some of it I'll come back to during the leadership report. Let me also say that it's a very packed agenda, so I'm going to try to go fast. One is we do have a final State Board of Ed budget. The budget process done. I think we will report on it, but I did just want to acknowledge that the good news is that we got research money, and at the last minute, the chairman's office put in dollars to enable us to make equity raises to assure that our salaries are equitable across the offices. And the chambers, anyway, I think not going to say more about that. I want to say one thing about sort of developing a new round of priorities, which is we sort of spent a busy spring sort of developing a set of priorities, setting up the working groups, getting a budget, and moving forward a set of products, which I'll talk about when we go to the working groups. But one result is that outside of the first retreat, to the working groups, and to some extent, to a lesser extent, the second retreat, there hasn't been an opportunity to sort of revisit the priorities, expand on them, add new ideas. We have a lot of new people just learning, and we have a limited set going forward. So what I'm thinking is that we'll try to do some of that in the summer, so the natural time to sort of take some more stock, and just put that on the table. And then hopefully in July we can have an extended conversation about that. Relevant to that, I know John Paul and staff are putting together a calendar of our meetings, so that we'll have a good feel for sort of the time that we have to put issues forward. One other issue I wanted to raise is, we talked in the admin meeting, we've been talking about sort of different ways of pulling our 20 offices together, and one of the things that I suggested was that so for back to school, I always put out a little flyer, what it looks like, that just sort of says what the board does, tells people how to reach out to me, and then gives information about the two offices. I think we did something like that for everybody, maybe one side for the name of the board member and sort of that information, the other side very much about the other offices, how to contact them, what they do, and maybe we
shows that we're continuing to grow as an office, and that, the work is important and needed throughout the city. I'd also like to share that in May, we had 90 cases, which is by far the highest that we've ever had in a month period. I don't know if you remember, when I testified, when we talked, when I did the last quarter report, I'd said we were tracking 60 cases as our record, and now 90 cases is the record. And by comparison, in quarter 4 last year, we had 108 cases. So we're starting to see quarter numbers in a month.
And I just want to underscore, clarify the piece or cases you're taking on.
Yeah, these are not
contacts.
This is not contacts. This is cases. Absolutely cases. So I'm going to skip this one and go to cases closed. So one of the things that you'll see that's new for us that we're tracking more carefully are the cases that we're closing, and the dates that you see around the pie chart are the dates of when those cases were open. 29% of the cases that were open, that were closed in quarter 3 were holdovers from quarter 2, which is actually, that's a really good number for us. So we're doing a really good job of staying efficient and keeping our cases in flow while also providing the services that, families need most. Now I'm gonna literally jump through all the way to year-to-date data. Okay. So, Marcus, as you brought up, our conversion rate has actually it has improved. We're 61% conversion compared to close to 50% last year. So not only are we getting more contacts, but we're converting those contacts to cases at a high rate. So far this year, we've had 824 contacts. That's right, yeah. Sorry, so today it's 955 contacts, and 534 have been converted to cases. We've already exceeded the number of cases that we handle. So this one is not updated. So now we have 532 cases, which exceeds the number of cases that we held for the entire year last year. Now, cases by category. Here you'll see that the most popular or common category you'll see are special education and school environment. That's typical, that's what all our presentations would typically show. These categories, the thing that is most interesting is that these categories change as students matriculate through school. So for example, special ed and bullying cases decrease from elementary to high school, whereas academic progress and discipline increase from elementary to high school. When we did a deep dive into our school environment cases, 2/3 of those were about staff issues that parents had with staff and incidents with staff, which really breaks down to staff misconduct or allegations of misconduct, and 1/3 of those were involving other students. So cases by special education services. Now, I talk about special education all the time. As you'll see in this chart, most of the special education cases that we have are IEP cases. Some 504, some people in the process of trying to request an evaluation. 46% of our cases, of our total cases across categories involve students who have special education or receive special education services. So, again, I feel like I'm saying the same things over and over again. You're seeing the trends. But I do want to highlight that 1/3 of our bullying cases are students who are receiving special education services. Also, 1/3 of our school environment cases are about kids who are receiving special education services. Then half of the callers that we receive from 7 and 8 receive special education services. Those numbers are scary, quite frankly. Cases by ward. So also new to this year, we've started comparing our data from school ward to the student's ward of residence. And what we found that while the bulk of our callers live in 7 and 8, the problems that they are experiencing they're experiencing throughout the city. So they're going to schools not just in ward 7 and 8. But we also see that based on our callers, a lot of the students in 7 and 8 go to school across the district, but very few kids out across the district are enrolling in schools in 7 and 8. And then more specifically, I think we've passed out this chart where you can see more, like, I think it's wards 5, 6, 7, and 8. Like, it's kind of overwhelming. Thank you. Like, particularly, take a look at 6. So here you'll see that 7, and this is not in the slide deck, so I apologize for that. But 71, we got 71 cases from schools in Ward 6, but most of those kids live in Ward 7 and 8. Right? Yeah. So you can see where students are coming from. One of the other things you hear me talking about all the time is cases by student race and the desire to have our callers be more representative across the demographics that we see in the city. We're actually getting a little bit better. So we've got 5% Hispanic Latinx callers for the year or year to date. I think we've done a ton of outreach at bilingual schools and attending events. I actually hired my program associate who is bilingual, so I'm very excited about that. Finally happened. And we did our first conflict management training at a bilingual school in the city, which went very well, by the way. So recommendations. Again, our annual report is likely going to be heavily focused on special education. Some of the recommendations that you hear that we're going to write about really include things that we've started to talk about already, but hopefully making them a lot more specific and I don't want to say but making them a lot more specific. So the first piece is around RTI and having a citywide RTI framework. One aspect of that, for example, is around like data collection, and so one of the things that happens is anything like less than an IEP does not transfer with a student. We would recommend that instead of only transferring the IEP, that you're transferring the 504s as well, and potentially any other like RTI data that was collected, that all of that is following the student when they're changing to another school, especially in DC, because our student population is very transient amongst the schools that they attend. It's rare that people, outside of Ward 4, right, like that you're going all the way through the system.
So why isn't that happening now?
Well, laws basically. the laws that are on book don't require that to happen. That's why it's not happening now.
And there's not a real framework for that to happen, right?
Yeah.
Because the 504 plan that happens in Ward 1 or 2 may not be the same 504 plan, or even for the same reasons in Wards 7 or 8, for instance. And so, like when a student transfer, we have cases where there are situations that have 504 plans in certain wards at certain schools that they would not get at other schools.
Can you give an example of that? I don't understand.
Yes, I am thinking specifically when it comes to the one that comes to mind is like students who have 504 plans specifically for ADHD. In a school in Upper Northwest, they see they will recognize all of the manifestations of that, right? School avoidance, talking back, all of those things are manifestations of ADHD. Whereas if you're in east of the river, if you're skipping class, you're skipping class, and it's not particularly a manifestation of your disability.
You've been diagnosed with ADHD?
Yeah.
How is that been documented? Is that something you guys have found in your data, or is that documented somewhere?
The differences, so in going to the meetings, in our data, when we go to the meetings, we hear this student has a 504 plan for this, while this student is being suspended for the same thing.
And I would say that it has less to do with where the school is actually located and more to do with where the student came from. Mm-hmm.
So what does a policy change or fix look like?
Yeah, I think that part of that is literally developing a citywide framework so that we have the same rule for this is what a 504 plan qualifications actually look like. These are the signs that you need to be looking for and applying to every student. But I think that there's also this understanding the full tier of services and having discrete checkpoints like throughout the year on how is a student performing, like how are they performing academically, but also assessing what is the behavioral pattern, right? Those are the two things that need to be looked at. If you have a student who is performing well or decently academically, but is having consistent behavioral things, needing behavioral support, that becomes the question of, do we give this child a 504? But to have the evaluations done periodically throughout the year to assess is this child who is receiving a 504 actually making progress? If they're making progress, can we backtrack to the RTI? Do they need to still receive the same supports that they have been receiving? Or is this the right level for them still? Or if it's not working, maybe we need to push this to an IEP and do the evaluation and assessment for an IEP. So I think that the steps and like the framework really involves like having these targeted things that are happening throughout the year rather than starting the year and then doing the evaluation at the end of the year, if that's happening at all. So I think that those are some of the pieces.
And the evaluations, are they, just so that we're very clear, who performs those evaluations?
Yeah.
And, you know, we keep hearing about counselor cuts and counselors not being reflective of the number of students in a building, et cetera.
So I see that you have something to say. Go for it.
So I think one of the things is like this addresses those cuts.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about an RTI plan, we're not talking about evaluations where a psychologist or has to come in and do an evaluation. We're talking about teachers looking at their data to see are students being successful. And so the goal is, if those are mandatory checkpoints throughout the year, then the teacher will see that this student needs to move from tier 1 to tier 2 interventions, or from tier 2 to tier 3. And hopefully the goal is to catch people at those tiers so that you don't have to wait till someone is tier 3 and 2 grade levels behind in order to get an IEP to address students' needs where they are.
So then the other piece to this is a part of our recommendation, and I think, so like at every level of the recommendation, we're also working to include like parent engagement, parent partnership, right? So what parent partnership looks like in the RTI framework is that parents understand the general education process, the RTI process, and to understand that if your child is having a problem, you don't necessarily have to just ask for the special education services or evaluation. You can also ask for all these other things. And even if your child does receive the special education evaluation and is found to like not need support, not need special education services, you can still request the RTI, right? Like, and these are things that a lot of parents don't know and don't understand. And I think that like a part of that is potentially in partnership with, right? Like we're making the recommendations and potentially working with OSSE with like how do we educate parents about these issues as well. You're welcome. So,
Can I ask one?
sure.
How do students get referred to for RTI? Is that strictly through a teacher doing it, or can it be through a special ed determination, or?
I mean, from what we've seen, it hasn't been, like, you're not getting to special ed, like, if you haven't gotten, either the parent has said something about it, or a teacher has said something about it. Now, because the special ed teachers or coordinators are not necessarily working directly with all students, I mean, that's not their job, so they wouldn't know, right? But then there are schools that have, like, these assessments throughout the year that they will flag a student who's, like, underperforming on an assessment, and flag that student for, we need to see if they need additional support services, maybe we'll do the RTI, if that doesn't work, right? That, in theory, that's how it's supposed to work. You do the assessment, you get the flag, and then you provide the intervention services before it's too late at the end of the year. Okay. So then, one of the other recommendations that we're thinking through is this mandatory manifestation hearing guidelines. We get calls a lot from parents and schools around manifestation hearings, and from what we've seen in some cases, not all cases, schools are waiting, like, because you don't have to do it until the 10th, after the 10th suspension is when you have to have, the 10th day of suspension is when you have to have a manifestation hearing to determine if the behavior of the child is a manifestation of a disability, right? sometimes you can see a lot early in the process that this is a manifestation of disability. Like, okay, suspended this child. Like, we don't actually have to wait like 10 days to have this conversation and think about, like what we can provide to the student now, right? And so our recommendation is we need to consider that and what is an appropriate duration of time. Also, in light of the fact that we now have the new laws on discipline, right, where schools are less likely to suspend and less likely to expel students, which in all likelihood would translate to it's going to take a lot longer to get to your 10 days, right? But all along, you're on the path, right? And the point is, we want you to get the services and the supports that you need, and not delay it. That's the point. The other piece around the manifestation hearing is thinking through, like, how can we make that process, I don't want to say more rigid, but more specific, right? Like, a lot of times it really is like a conversation. Parents aren't always, while they are required to have like notice and be invited to attend, like, it doesn't necessarily have to be like 24 hours or at a time that's convenient, right? So let's talk through like, what does parent engagement and parent partnership look like when it comes to manifestation hearings? Okay, then we talked about transparency on in-house special education programs. So some of the issues we see, and I think it ties into like the placement. Parents often will put a school on their in their lottery selection. You know, it looks really good. It seems like they have a really nice campus and facility. Like, my child has special needs. I'm going to go to the school, and then we find out that the school is not really equipped to deal with the service, and they're scrambling either to hire the appropriate staff to provide the service, or they're referring out. To what extent can we get transparency on because schools can't deny service, right? We know that. But can we at least say this is what we provide in-house already? And could that be helpful? I think it would be helpful to a lot of parents so that they're seeing the services that are already there at the school, but that aren't being referred out.
I think
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, so just an example, like some charter schools don't have special ed services, so they will, if the child is in the program or in the system, they go to like a DCPS school, this for service, and not necessarily
Right.
transfer to the school. So they still do that, how they don't?
Yeah, so it doesn't work with charter schools. Charter schools are obligated to provide that service. Yeah.
Okay.
I think
Yeah, DCPS no longer provides special ed service to any LEAs except Sacramento.
Yes.
And I think that's a very special relationship.
Yeah.
this came about from yes, our data, but also listening to you all in the conversations at the hearings, asking these questions, and the responses have been that, well, the law says that every LEA has to provide the services. And so this recommendation is not about telling what services the LEA can provide, because we know, wonderful, every LEA can provide the service, right? But it's about what services are you providing in-house, so that parents can know before you put it in, okay, I do understand that for this school, you can provide the service, but it's going to be at a non-public placement. Or you can provide the service in-house at this school.
I think we talked about this. I think we were talking about, like, would it be helpful to include on a report card, for instance? But then I think it was you guys. I thought you were saying that the problem with that, maybe it's you, Jen, that the problem with that is that when somebody leaves the school, like, it might just be that they have somebody who's providing that service at the school, a staff member who then, when they leave, they no longer can claim that they're, like, doing that. And then it's really hard, right? For schools
Yeah.
to maintain.
And I think yes, we were a part of this conversation, and I think it's true in the sense that this is different from what we talked about. Because
Okay.
what we had talked about was what schools are doing providing what service, like, very well. That's how, like, right? Like, so, like, this,
Established.
right, it's just, like, established. This is not that same recommendation. This is just to say, we have staff in our building, and we provide this service in-house. Now, does that change over time? Absolutely. The special ed coordinators change over time. Bullying coordinators change over time. Also, even a student who is like enrolls or thinks they're gonna go to one school, to a particular school, like this time of year, like through the enrollment process, they filled out the paperwork, right? Like if they get off the wait list at another school and they decide, nah, I don't wanna go to school A, I wanna go to school B instead, like that changes all the time too.
Right.
So I think that part of this is in looking at the whole like special education like structure and looking at our recommendations and how the system like can work. One is there is no perfect answer, none. And the question then becomes, what is the baseline of information that we can provide to make it better, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with that said, in theory, all schools should be providing all services.
I mean, they're
In
yes,
theory,
they're
and so
legally required
a
to.
school would list that we provide these services, although a parent should assume, if needed, they would provide any service.
No, they have to provide the services. This recommendation isn't about whether the service is going to be, because the service can be provided either in-house, like you have staff to do it, or they're referring out and paying for it, right? So this is to say we have this service in-house, we have a staff member who provides this.
Right.
Yep.
And some of those, and I know this just anecdotally from some of my students, but some of those are also out-of-state placements.
Yeah. Yep.
They're sending kids out of state.
Yeah.
No, these kids are good.
Every day.
Yeah, these kids are good. It really depends on the need.
What kind of system?
Yeah, there's some of them.
Yeah.
They're busing them to a different school, right?
Oh,
I thought you meant like they're going there and coming back to a school in DC.
Oh,
No.
What that doesn't take into account is outcomes, right? Like just because they're providing that service in-house doesn't
No,
mean
that's absolutely true.
doesn't mean they're doing it well.
Wow, that is absolutely true.
And so an external placement might be better in certain circumstances.
That is absolutely true, right? And like, which is absolutely true. And to the point that I mean that in the question that I'm raising, my response is, what's the baseline that we can do this better, right?
Right,
But
right.
yes, absolutely, it's not perfect, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think we all have to understand we're never ever going to be perfect, but we need to be continually
To push,
pushing
and keep them
closer to
yeah.
perfect.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And, I mean, I talked already about family engagement for families, for students who are receiving special education services. I think one of the final recommendations that we're making specifically around the SPED, am I over time? Oh, huh?
Not yet.
No, okay. But specifically around like what the meeting process looks like to develop the IEP plan in our various plans, and making sure that there is like a more level playing field and that it's a student-centered approach and that the parents has an equal voice in that process. And there are various strategies that we'll talk about in the annual report. Yeah, we'll flesh out a little bit more. But yeah, those are our recommendations. I think we're good. Any other questions?
Just have a general question. Outside of this conversation, how are you all advancing these recommendations?
We're gonna write them in our annual report. So, yeah, essentially, we'll write everything in the annual report. We're doing all the research and all those pieces now. And after we've completed like the final version of the annual report, this is setting us up for what happens next school year. Yeah.
So the annual report comes out when?
It comes out in October, but we have to be done essentially by, is it August? Early August, in order to get everything to the editor, to get everything printed. So this is our summer. Yeah, this is our summer. So we'll have like solid concrete like recommendations and the full outline. Everything will be done for us by like early August.
Maybe you need some
Yes, I do.
I have a comment and then I have a recommendation of my own.
Yeah.
The comment is this is incredibly helpful and is historically we've just gotten sort of raw data and we're not really able to unpack that other than once a year when we do get the annual report. So having this conversation now is incredibly helpful and in us seeing sort of where the trends are and where things are going and recommendations that might come out of your office. And I think beyond my recommendation would be beyond just having it in your annual report, this body has the ability to do research, to partner with your office, and to elevate the discussion so that it's not just put on a shelf somewhere, that we actually include it in our annual report too, and that we have, you know, either a hearing around this or, you know, a roundtable discussion where we talk about what these solutions might look like in practice.
Yeah, I mean, and I think like through the admin committee, like we've had conversation around like what that might look like and like, you know, all the specific, like the moving forward. I think that for me, the only thing that I really want to make sure that I get through is that we have concrete, fully fleshed out ideas that are written in the annual report, and then figure out what's next.
Yeah, I'd want to make sure this doesn't get stuck in the admin committee. This is a policy issue, not an administrative
No,
issue.
and my implication wasn't that it would be stuck in the admin, just that I wanted to let you know that these conversations are also happening with the admin committee, and I think like as time goes on and as we tighten up what's happening in the admin committee, they will come. Yeah, I mean, and please tell me.
Yeah, no, I mean,
yeah.
part, you know, as we've talked, it's sort of been, to your point, Jack, it's sort of, well, we really to try to figure out how we can do the research project, and what would that look like? So I think we're sort of providing that on the way, with the ideas,
Yeah.
the recommendations, and we come to everybody.
Yeah, like, and we're brainstorming all of this stuff.
Any feedback now.
Yeah.
For sure, the intent of having the leaders of those two offices in our admin committee meeting regularly to have to, you know, keep that conversation going was with the full intention of making sure that the board is fully involved in the public work of those offices are doing. So, yeah.
And I'll just say, part of the conversation is to try to kind of figure out what that they're doing.
How
And it makes sense here, it's sort of a messy conversation that sort of takes a lot
Yeah.
of them
Yeah.
to get, but that's what we're doing, so you're hearing sort of a more focused version, and hopefully we'll get more and more focused. And,
Yep.
That research you talked about, or not research, the data on the 504 plan differences across the boards seems really important. And I'm just wondering in what state is that data right now? Like, is it just, like, would we be able to, seems like it would make a good partner. I mean, I'm not saying you should write it necessarily, but is that data in a form that could be shared, or is there something somebody could do to easily make it more?
What'd you say? Oh, sorry.
Thinking that it might be a bit done, but I don't think it would be as easy.
Yeah.
That's personal information.
I think it's something that we need to follow up on. Yeah.
It's really important and interesting.
Yeah. No,
Really.
I think it's something that we should follow up on. I'm happy to have this conversation with you. Like, yeah, but no, it's not currently in a state where it can be shared.
Yeah, are you talking about having like the recommendations put in an article with like top lines of the data, or?
This is really thinking out loud. So
No, of course. Because I mean,
Even if
that could be done, like not an in-depth article, but like something with top lines, kind of what Serena just shared, and then her recommendations for moving forward. Could do something like that.
Yeah, or I mean, it could be sort of, I think that the work that, it could be multiple objectives, right? I think the work that you do is incredibly important, and a lot of people don't know about it, so it could be kind of highlighting the work that you do. And then also it could be highlighting some of the findings that come from doing this work, or it could be completely separate from the work that you do. It could just be data that you happen to
I mean, like,
But I think there's something underneath that, right?
Right.
That could be connected to like the identification stats that you mentioned also. But just throwing my 2 cents in there. One question I did have on the mandatory manifestation guidelines that you mentioned. I've heard from schools that the behavioral legislation, I forget what the exact name of it is like having real implications in schools, and schools are feeling like their hands are tied for like basic disciplinary actions. So like, are there specific, I know you said at the 10th suspension, is there like a new recommendation in light of that policy in terms of time or when you might want to hold those?
The manifestation hearings.
Yeah.
So for us, like the manifestation hearings happen for special education students, and it's separate from the new law. But because of the new law on the new discipline law, but because with the new discipline law, it essentially will take longer.
Makes it harder to suspend kids, which
Right.
means it takes longer to get to the 10th day.
Right. So we don't yet have, and I don't know that we will come up with a specific like 5 or 3, like whatever, right? I don't know that we will get that specific, but looking at examining and considering shortening that 10-day period. Now, Dan and I actually spent a lot of time talking about principal feedback from the discipline law, parent feedback from the discipline law, and the overall impact, right, on the discipline law. When I look at the law, when I read the law, like essentially it says that students can be suspended and expelled for bodily injury and harm. They can be suspended for like fighting. Also, the city has moved to a more restorative justice oriented and doing right, like which is wonderful. What we have seen is that mediations that schools say that they're doing are not real mediations. Like they're not like equipped yet to provide that level of service to students. Like it's just not it's not happening in a way that's like best practice. And there are problems. So yeah, there are problems. Now for our particular annual report, I don't know that we're going to go there this year. I think it's an issue that we have flagged, and that we're in conversation, actually with some of high schools about as well. And I'd be happy to talk to you more about where we're going with that more.
It would be really helpful to get that number. I don't know if you want to put that in your report or even offline, just for a policy level conversation, because I think that's a real unintended consequence of like a well-intentioned policy for like students receiving the services that they need.
Yeah. Fair. All right, we're gonna move on again, but so my summation of this is just to think about you guys, but also anybody, sort of a piece of something in there that we can pay attention to, do some research on, release that will sort of draw attention to the problem, and the need for a solution, I should say, and what that would look like. And then the second, which it sounds like is part of what you're in, is going to be sort of what framework would look like. I guess specifically for the RTI, that might then be something that we could sort of talk to people about as a policy.
Yeah.
Dan, okay.
So, like Sue, and I'm gonna blow through some of my slides, just so we can get to some of the media parts. So the first thing I want to get out, I know we've heard talked about it a lot, is the discipline guide kind of manual for families. So we have it printed, it's out, it's hitting schools, it's hitting service providers, it is on the street, and it's making its way. The great thing about the guide is even though it's online, it's online, and everything that's in the guide can kind of be pulled out to stand alone. So if there are things that you just want to put up in your school building or put out for community members, just like as a flyer or as a poster, you can just pull that out. You don't need to have the whole guide, displayed. The things that where we talk about schools can and school cannot, you may not want to have that in your school building for kids. But there are things there as far as terms to know, things that can just making interactions for parents easier. our data. So in quarter three, we had 140. We received 149 contacts. 119 of those became requests for assistance, where we engaged the parent. We got some sort of resolution. The majority of things were provided with resources and information. A lot of these opportunities turned into opportunities where we provided coaching and kind of talking parents through the process. Again, one of the great things that we're kind of seeing in our calls and kind of where calls are coming from is that we're getting a lot of word of mouth and a lot of kind of self research. So folks are finding us through internet search, Facebook, finding us through some of our social media postings. So it's one of those things where where our office is kind of self-naturally advertising. So it's a positive sign that we're trending right. As we look at kind of our topic areas for our RFA, one of the things that jumps out right away is enrollment access. It was big this quarter. One of the things that we saw a lot about, we got a lot of calls around placement decisions, whether or not when parents get notified that their current placement isn't working out, or that there may need to be a change, as well as parents being notified that they would not be allowed to re-enroll.
Can you say something about the circumstances under which students are told they can't re-enroll?
For DCPS, if you are in an out-of-boundary school and you have attendance and behavioral issues, it is the principal has a lot of discretion to whether to allow you to re-enroll. And so they're not able to kick you out right then and there during the middle of the school year, but they will send a letter home and a notice home. And I think actually on that letter, both our office and the Ombudsman office is listed as resources to follow up on before this is finalized. Essentially, there's very little window of getting that letter and you're actually returning to that school. If you get that letter, essentially you need to engage in the lottery. They usually try to send it out before the lottery starts, so folks can participate in the lottery. And that's why quarter three we saw the spike.
Do students have to miss the required 20 days before they can receive that letter, or?
So for the 20 days, that's a consecutive 20 days, and that's to get dropped from the rolls. But this is just, I come to school tardy every day, or I come, it's very much
more lenient.
Right, it's much more. There's a lot more gray here. And for charters, it's even the gray area is even larger because there's much more discretion there as far as who they allow to maintain at their campuses.
Wait, I don't understand. So in the DCPS school, if you're out of bounds, there can be this policy.
Right.
In the charter school.
In the charter schools, it's essentially a citywide. So
Under any circumstance, you can be. So what's the circumstance?
So generally, it's for behavior and tardy and lateness.
And is there does each school have its own standard for that? Is it consider the kind of behavior that we're being thrown out? This is the kind
Yes.
of
There's essentially 65 different policies or 65 different interpretations. And honestly, it's really 250 different interpretations because it's at the principal's discretion.
And my understanding is that the decisions and the criteria and CPS now they're centralized, so there's not actually a lot of discretion at the school level.
So I would say for DCPS, there is a lot of discretion at the school level. But I would say for the most part, it's more of a reflection of where that school is. For schools that are highly sought after, for some of the Capitol Hill Ward 6 schools, which are highly sought after, there's a lot of you'll see this more of. In schools east of the river, you'll see it for behavior change. You won't see it, and it's generally for specific older students that are providing challenge for those school clients. The other thing that we saw with enrollment access in regards to older students, we're going to talk about this a little bit later in some of the recommendations that when we talked about trends, was that older students being asked to leave. So students that are overaged and undercredited. And so they are essentially, once they've hit 18 or hit 17, and they're 2 grades beyond, 2 grades or 1 grade behind level, they are being asked to either go to an alternative setting. So that be it more, be it one of the stage programs.
This is again both ECPS and PLIS?
This is specifically, especially for ECPS, charters. It's usually out of there before they get to the place where they're 2 grade levels or several grade levels behind. Also, conversely, looking at this, one of the things that, even though enrollment access is large, if you combine our student safety and our student discipline, our student behavior, as well as our kind of communication and engagement and abuse and neglect, you'll see more things that are reflective of student culture and school climate. So that's another thing that, Serena and I have been having a lot of conversations. There's been a lot of conversations just in general about what's happening in our school climate, our school culture. This year we've done something different, and it's really, we've started tracking things by grade bands, and you'll see that in our annual report where we'll make some recommendations on things that should be happening for elementary schools, things that can be happening for middle schools, and things that are happening specifically to high schools. As you see, for the most part, most of our calls this quarter were from elementary schools. It's kind of what's always held true. DCPS is, was the majority of our calls. The charter sector coming in a close second. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Are you getting higher levels of calls at elementary schools because it seems like a problem that elementary schools particularly are facing in terms of what you're getting, or is it that it's like a higher level of parent engagement? Or
I think there's a high level of parent engagement at that level, but also I think, because we did see a spike in calls related to student placement calls in regards to special education. I think that's where we saw a lot of parent engagement. Yeah.
And that just tends to be, the placement calls tend to be an elementary issue.
The placements occur across, but I would say there's more of a panic for an elementary school parent, let's say, that has multiple children in an LEA or a campus about, now one of my kids needs to go someplace else. And so, whereas that child in high school, that, they need to go to another campus, but they can make those travel arrangements without, a big push or a big contribution on my part.
Oh, so placement is, I was thinking subject matter placement, you're talking about placement in the school.
Correct. So this quarter we saw a reflection in some of our outreach. Our Hispanic Latino numbers jumped, as well as some of our non-African American numbers have jumped. It's just something that we need to continue to plug at, and something that we'll continue to work on. We're spending a lot of time this summer as well. So we also break down our RFAs by race and ward. More than anything, I think what's probably more beneficial to folks is starting on slide 22, where we break it down by the data by school ward and type of school. So whether it's an in-boundary DCPS school, whether it's an out-of-boundary family, whether in a public charter school, and they are coming from that ward or coming from outside of it. So slides 23 and slides 22, details that. So, before we get into kind of our overall year-to-date, I want to talk about some trends and things that kind of more canary in the gold mine type of things. And so, we broke down our kind of topic areas by school ward. And so, in Ward 1, one of the things that came up was enrollment access was leading the way in student safety. I'm going to be very, very, very blunt about when we talk about student safety, we're really talking about, for the most part, bullying in Ward 1. And when we're talking about in the enrollment access cases, where we're talking essentially placement. Ward 2, again, enrollment access was essentially placement. In Ward 3 and Ward 4, we had a small number of Ward 3 cases, but it was a placement case. There was only DCPS schools, and the DCPS school that they would need to go to was they got into that game. The DCS school that they needed to go to was on the other side of town, and it was a no-go for them. Award 4, special ed disability was definitely placement again. And wards 5, 6, bullying was definitely part of it, but there's also safe passage issues of student violence in particular. So I think we're using the word bullying in a very broad sense, not the DC definition sense of bullying, but really incidents of violence. And that's hold true for Ward 8 as well, as far as the student safety. We're more so bullying, but really incidents of violence. At school or near coming from school involving students. In 7, one of the things that kind of popped out was academic instructions, and this is where one of the things that we wanted to bring to the table for you guys to kind of talk about. We saw this trend of retaliation being brought up a lot. Not necessarily retaliation in the fact of schools doing something, but schools threatening retaliation. So there was a lot of CFSA. So one of the things when we checked it now, is out of those 119 calls, we had around, I would say 30% of those calls mentioned CFSA, and 16 of those calls in that 30% were not related to the attendance reporting. It was just an incident occurred, communication broke down, the parent made an allegation that the school said they were going to call CFSA on us, or they were going to call Champs Mental Health on us if we didn't become compliant.
So that's the reason for reaching out to you, is that they're being threatened.
Correct. They had whatever communication kind of broke down, and those allegations were being made, and it cuts across both DCPS and PCS. So I don't know if it's a tactic that has just been widely used to gain some more compliance and leverage, but it is becoming something that we just saw in this quarter was really prevalent. And as we're going over kind of our trends and thinking about recommendations and things that could be that need a solution that we don't have, and things that can be brought to the table to where you guys can provide your leadership with it, I think that is something that that needs there's a there that should be explored.
Is that across wards?
Yes. So we're still going through our data. We're going to go through more through this quarter, not just this quarter, but the rest of the year as we prepare for our annual report. And as we find stuff, I'll share that out. But it was something that was kind of alarming.
Yeah.
This is a continuing theme, as all of you guys, as you work together, sort of understand how you break this apart, what's in your office and what's in yours. I think for us, it's a continuing effort to fully understand the distinction. So when you get a call, if it's specific to a family that needs remediation with the school, that goes to the Ombudsman, and then what you deal with is sort of a specific.
I gotta make it simpler than that.
Yeah.
We usually take 5 steps. If we can't resolve and get you to where you need to be in 5 steps, we're making that referral to the Ombudsman, to AJE, CLC, DCPS grievance, and instructional superintendent. But in 5 steps, if we're not able to immediately, within that 24 to 48 hours, get you on the right path, we're connecting you someplace else.
So the first set of steps you take are actually similar to the first set of steps you guys take, and then it sort of diverges.
And I think to give context, sometimes it's hard for us to refer cases back to OSSE, when they call us first, because we can do it in less than 5 steps, right? 5 steps or less, right? So why would you just send them over? Because it's a whole nother hassle for the family to have to whatever, go through this again. But I think because the Ombudsman office I don't know. My theory is because the Ombudsman office was created first. That's why we have a higher volume when there's a chunk of the calls that we get that really belong in OSSE.
Do you think it also has something to do with parents and families not understanding exactly the breakdown of each office, and they just have a number and here's the number now?
Yeah,
So I think there's that. I also think parents are calling us in crisis for the most part, and it is I'm calling the numbers that
Yeah.
that are
Yeah.
I have.
They
Right.
call all their
They call all
They
their
call
numbers.
it, and
Yeah.
you know,
That's right.
to be honest, to get to us, you've done some work.
Yeah.
You know, you've gone through some people.
But last time we were talking, I came up with the navigation versus mediation, and you guys kind of felt like that was pretty accurate.
Yep.
Is that helpful?
Mhm.
Someone? Yeah. It helped me a lot.
I mean, I always, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when I'm talking to a family or students, I try to say that the ombudsman is there to help with representing the student and their rights, whereas, or the chief student advocate, whereas the ombudsman is there to mediate the session with all parties to come out with a sufficient outcome for all.
I think that's,
Okay.
I think more or less that's accurate.
Okay. I'm fine with the ombudsman representation.
Okay.
So going on to some of the other parts that we do in the office, the other big part of what we do in the office is community facing and being in the community, doing outreach events, and just not meeting parents where they are. And so in addition to our request for assistance, we've gone out and we've done 78 panels, 78 school visits, 78 physical touches where someone from our office was in place and physically able to interact with folks. To date, we've had 5,000 touches via one of our engagement outreach modes. So that's physical touch, that's phone calls, that's information being distributed at schools. One of our big pushes was getting the family go-to guide, getting that out, and making sure that's in the hands of parents. So that's been a touch that's been going well for us. Kind of where we are today, this is actually not accurate because this is of our May 1st date. Right now we're at 459, and so we are past our number we are past the number from where we are last year as far as our days. And we're continuing, if we continue our trend, we'll definitely break 500. Generally after June, late June, kind of things slow down dramatically for us.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So that's kind of where we are today. And we compare our outreach access to where we were last year. That was only 3,300 touches. This year we're at 5,000 touches. We'll probably, hopefully, end up the year with some of the close out stuff for the year. Hopefully around 5.5, maybe 6. Again, these are some of the things that we anticipated. In February during the quarter, we hosted a series of pre-K DC public education sessions at child development centers, not daycare. Right. So we went to several CDCs and really spoke to them about explaining their options as far as engaging in the lottery, selecting PK3 schools, questions to ask, things they should just be mindful of. We participated in the Black Lives Matters week for the week of action. In March, we dropped our discipline guide online. We put it in public. We have it in paper now. So it's going out to schools. We spent some time at 3 public charter schools as well as engaging. We have a large Latinx population that we engage with, as well as several others from NYC and some other nonprofit organizations. And then again, more than anything, we spent a lot of time in the state passage. That is essentially us. I think everyone's at this point really anxious. I think there's a lot of anxiety about what's happening for the summer. And we had Marcus and ourselves. We had our awarded Safe Passage working group, and a lot of the information that's out there is concerning about what those plans are for the summer. I would say we got there's some early conversations with other parts of the city, some other parts that we've had I've had some conversations with Southwest. 6, and it's just there's a lot of folks who are not being connected to central planning and central voice. I think there's a lot of things that people are doing in silos that just aren't connecting that aren't connecting to parents. And so I think more than that, not connected to parents, they're not connected to students. So that's kind of the concern.
So in terms of what we should be advocating for, is that a good focus is trying to connect these
So I think
different
there's
initiatives or
right. So even if you just think about the summer initiatives, connecting OST funded programs to DPR sites, connecting that to what's happening and when schools will be open for summer school, and then not even that, and then connecting that as well as to this SYP. So where are there going to be SYP workers? Where will there be some of the sites? Where will there be summer schools? So offering that kind of what are the expectations for that? So what will be those? What are the times for dismissal? What are the times for arrival? Our student are they going to be like last year where everyone got paid on Tuesday, and that Tuesday became the day where a lot of kids experienced violence. What are the things? What are we doing? What are we doing as a city to be mindful?
So what would help with that? Like, do we need to advocate for somebody or several?
So I think there's a lot.
Coordinate?
Right. So I think there's a lot of folks that are trying to coordinate. I think the problem.
Maybe that's
Part of the problem is getting as just this time of year between schools letting out and people ramping up for summertime, and so it's getting OST folks as well as kind of school folks on the same page in the same place. And I think that usually doesn't happen until something happens.
right. Yeah.
I know in the past there was the issue with trying to get DCPD to engage. Has that been rectified?
So I think MPD has been MPD has been trying to be a better partner. I know they kind of share their SRO plan. They've been very frank about what they're going to do with their summer crime initiatives. And I think they've been very open. They want to be as open as possible so folks can kind of know where they'll be and kind of folks can kind of plan on that. I think part of the problem is that MPD is very reactive. I think we've developed some other opportunities with the One's office, with Cure the Streets, and some other folks that are doing violence prevention work or restorative justice work, and it's trying to get those folks incorporated into those same systems, as well as having the same conversations with the folks from Wilmota Transit and the other agencies that are involved.
But I'll say it's been really invaluable getting all of these partners into the room. Because just at our last meeting, there are folks just in Ward 8 right alone who are doing things in like these pockets, and so being able to see where they're doing it, when they're doing it, and kind of where the gaps are, is really valuable for the folks who are going to lead this work over the summer. But I think to Dan's point, it's concerning that summer's not months away, right? It's weeks away, and the coordination between like these agencies, these nonprofits who want to lead this work doesn't give any of us confidence that that we're prepared for it, especially witnessing the uptick in violence that we're seeing already, and so that has to work better long term. But I think we got some good people on the ground, but where they're not, I think is the most important. target areas for the summer that we're going to be there, summer crime initiatives and things like that. But, you know, like I said, those transition periods and then the non-traditional hours, right? You know, 5 p.m. to 11, where, you know, people hours also going to be a concern. Well, that's the purpose of the neighborhood safety and engagement office, and I think they're doing the best they can with what they've got.
Thank you very, very much. To be continued.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you guys. Guys and gals. I use guys collectively.
We're gonna roll.
Yeah, just scoot.
Chair around.
I push you, but I can't let you push me back. Like, I don't know if that works.
I say you all.
That's a tough
Sorry, we're running on the chairs. I don't want to cut you off.
Is it a slow right? Yeah, so everything's
Kind of.
That's terrible.
I'm kind of giving you a
No,
good
I'm on
look.
it.
A good laugh.
So, yes, it's ready to vote.
Hi everyone. So glad to be here with you all. I am here to, I think, share a long-awaited presentation and an update around high school growth. I think the good news, just to give the headline, as you all may have seen in the materials, is I think we have a very strong and viable proposal to get to incorporating high school growth, which I know we've all been eager to do. And I'm excited to share that pathway with you all and explain sort of the thinking that went into it, why we think it's the strongest possible pathway, and share just the context behind our recommendation. Oh, sure, yeah, I was just saying, so I thought I had a sprained ankle, so I've been walking around on it, and it turns out there's a broken bone in my foot, and so walking around on it was not a good thing, and so now I can't put any weight on it for a month, so, yeah, so you'll see me in the cast and crutches for a while, and possibly a boot after that, so, yeah, thank you, appreciate it. I've been getting a lot of looks around the office, so. All right, so I'll go ahead and jump on in. I will try and move through these pretty quickly so we can get to discussion, but absolutely feel free to stop me if there are clarifying questions along the way. So I wanted to just review with you all, because I know some members are new here, just talk through sort of the commitments we've made in the past, share our plan and timeline and the considerations that went into it, and then we have a few additional slides in the appendix as well. So our commitments. So throughout the SS State Plan engagement, we had expressed our commitment to student growth, and I know that was incredibly important to the board as well. It's something we also heard a lot of community feedback around. So as you all probably know, right now all frameworks in the STAR framework, elementary, middle, and high school, include at least 2 different growth metrics. They include attendance growth, which is part of the best of chronic absenteeism metric, and they include access growth, which measures the progress of English learners. So the attendance growth looks at the improvement in your chronic absenteeism rate over the prior year, and we look at that compared to your actual chronic absenteeism rate, and you get points for whichever one you did the better on. And then the access growth measure, again, looks at the progress of our English learners in gaining proficiency in the English language, speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Then the elementary and middle school STAR frameworks incorporate 2 additional measures of academic growth specifically. median growth percentile, and growth to proficiency. The academic growth metrics together combined are worth 40 points, which is the largest single component of the elementary and middle school frameworks. And certainly the board's push around this, as well as community feedback, was instrumental to making that true. In our original draft proposal, OSSE had proposed achievement and growth each being weighted at 40 points, and the biggest push around community feedback that we heard was that growth should be weighted more than achievement, and the total weight on those two components should be lowered. We took both of those points of feedback into account in our final proposal that was approved by the board by lowering the weight on achievement by 10 points, and therefore having growth be weighted more in elementary and middle school. We've also stated from the beginning our commitment to also including growth for high schools. We were no less interested in that. We simply had some technical reasons why we were not able to incorporate it at the time that I will go into later in the presentation. But in order to fully express and explicitly state that commitment, in our final SL state plan, we committed in writing to bringing a proposal on how to include high school growth to the state board at the end of this, should say, apologies, 18-19 school year. So we'll update that and send that to you. So here we are at the end of the 2018-19 school year and presenting this proposal. We're following through on that today. I want to note that while we are reporting out on that proposal, ultimately incorporating growth into the STAR framework is a substantive change, and it will require state board approval to include in the state plan when the measures are fully developed, which is not what we're doing today. So we're not teeing up for a vote right now. At the point we are ready, we will continue to have discussions leading up until that point, and we'll need your all's approval before we can finalize incorporation. And finally, I just want to say what we all know, that we know that student growth matters to parents and to educators. We know that we need to recognize the impact the school has on improving a student's learning, no matter where they're starting out. We heard about this consistently, and probably the most consistently of any point of feedback throughout the SL state plan process. We've continued to hear questions and interest from you all and the community since then. I know we heard a lot of great testimony also from the expert panels that you all have convened, and we think that the proposal we're about to share is in line with a lot of what we've heard. So plan and timeline. So our plan is to work toward including normative and or criterion reference growth metrics in calculations for the STAR framework for high schools in fall 2021, which will be the results from the data from the 2020-2021 school year. By normative and or criterion reference, what I mean is normative, an example of a normative measure is our current MGP, median growth percentile measure for elementary and middle schools, and an example of the criterion reference growth measure is our growth to proficiency metric for elementary and middle schools. So we would look to hopefully include both types of measures for high school as well. We are saying and or here because there's still some technical work to do, as I'll get into, and we of course want to make sure that this proposal, as you can see from the asterisk at the bottom, would be pending the approvals required from you all as well as the U.S. Department of Education, and it's pending the necessary validity checks on the metrics. In order to accomplish working towards that proposal, we are going to be taking the following actions. In the upcoming school year and the one after that, so over the next 2 years, we will be developing and modeling both the normative and criterion reference growth metrics, hopefully for potential inclusion of both, but checking on the technical validity of both. And so I think we feel very confident that we will be able to include at least one, pending your all's approval. We hope that we would actually be able to have both. In order to do that, beginning this upcoming school year 1920, we will require statewide assessments in high school for Algebra 1 and English 1, as well as for geometry and English 2. So we will continue our current state assessments and also require statewide assessments in high school for Algebra 1 and English 1. The reason for this, the rationale for this plan is listed here, and I'll talk through these different components because I think they're actually each quite important to understand. So first, this pathway provides 2 different opportunities for schools to demonstrate growth. From 8th grade ELA and math tests to English 1, Algebra 1, and then also from Algebra 1, English 1 to English 2 geometry. So in the same way that an elementary school that's pre-K to 5 gets to look at growth from both grade 3 to grade 4 and grade 4 to grade 5, this proposal actually allows us to look at growth at 2 different intervals, and similarly middle schools have multiple intervals where we can look at growth. It would also provide us the opportunity to report school, LEA, and state level performance on Algebra 1 and English 1 for the first time, which will provide us more opportunities to see progress in achievement as well as on growth. As you all heard from the panel testimony, there are a number of schools across DC that already administer Algebra 1 and English 1 to all of their students, but because it's not been a required state assessment up until now, it's been an optional LEA and school decision, it's not something that we've reported out on publicly and has not been true and consistent across all students. So by requiring it and administering it consistently, it will give us the opportunity to look at much more data and information publicly in a way that we have not until now.
What about students who take Algebra 1 in 8th grade for middle school?
Yeah, those we have included because they're taking it as a required test. So
Okay.
we've been reporting out on those students, but not students who take it optionally. So they took the 8th grade math test in 8th grade. In 9th grade, they take Algebra 1, but it's taken as an optional test, right? And then in 10th grade, they're taking geometry. For those students, we have not been reporting Algebra 1.
Okay.
We've only been reporting it when it's being taken as their required state test in that grade.
Okay.
We also know that foundational skills in Algebra 1 and English 1 are critical for success in college and careers. Particularly Algebra 1 skills are much more foundational for college level mathematics than geometry tends to be. And so we think actually being able to provide this data and information is not only an extra grade level, but a particularly important grade course level, I should say. Multiple assessments also provide more coverage of our content standards and clearly set the expectations for our high school students. And then assessing students primarily in the 9th and 10th grade, as opposed to later in high school, allows schools to improve in their early interventions and supports for students. We all know how critical the 9th grade year is, which is when Algebra 1 and English 1 are most commonly taken, and so making sure that everyone has the information they need to target early interventions and supports feels particularly crucial. Also, due to significant student mobility that we see in DC, where students are moving schools, particularly across grade levels, adding the Algebra 1 and English 1 assessments ensures that more students are included in growth calculations, which is really critical. One of the biggest things we realized as we were exploring our different high school growth options was that to try and generate a growth measure from 8th grade math to geometry, or from 8th grade English to English 2, meant we were looking at growth across usually a 2-year time span, right? 2-year time span for the biggest proportion of our students. But because of student mobility, it is very hard to accurately attribute that growth then. You don't know which school to attribute it to. And if you drop out, for the sake of then accuracy, if you drop out all of the students who have moved in that time, then you're losing many of our most vulnerable students. So student mobility has been a significant complicating factor as we've been thinking about this growth proposal. By including Algebra 1 and English 1, we capture many more of those students because we are looking at the 2 different intervals. So there are many more students who are included in at least one of the intervals and possibly in both. The implementation timeline also incorporates the time needed to then model the metric and use best practices to address complexities. I think we've heard a lot of testimony on this, and it's an approach we've taken with all of our other assessment or accountability decisions up until now, being able to look at taking the time to model the metric, make sure that it's technically valid and sound before we make the decision to incorporate it. So this implementation timeline would allow us to do that. Right now, because only a subset of our students have taken Algebra 1 and English 1, we simply do not have the data to model this accurately across the city. By administering the assessments fully this upcoming year, by next summer we will have the data to do that modeling prior to implementation. So the implementation time,
On that point, did you say that the tests are going to be administered citywide before they're approved as part of our ESSA plan?
That's right, because they would not be, the approval of the state board is related to the specific accountability decisions. This upcoming year is simply a decision to require the assessment, and the assessment administration policy is something that's in the process of doing. The implementation timeline you can see here. So in spring 2020, part of this upcoming school year, schools would administer the assessments in Algebra 1, Geometry, English 1, and English 2. And the work would continue to develop a criterion reference growth metric in high school. In summer 2020, schools, and we should also say the public, would receive performance data on the new assessments, and results would be used to begin modeling growth for grade 8 ELA math to English 1, Algebra 1 assessments. And then in the winter, we would we would work on an ongoing plan engagement and approval process around high school growth measures and measuring weights. And we would need to sync this up also with where the U.S. Department of Education's timelines are. They have put out in the past timelines around states submit amendments to us by X date, we can guarantee turnaround decision by Y date. So we will continue to monitor those closely. We would continue working on engagement and or approval through spring 2021. In spring 2021, schools would also administer the assessments for the second year. In the summer then, we would also see the performance data on the new assessments again. We would be able to then use the results to model growth for Algebra 1 to Geometry and English 1 to English 2 that summer. And then metric validity analysis would be completed before inclusion into the STAR framework. And then in fall 2021, the STAR framework would be released. So again, the rationale for the timeline is recognizing the need to collect an Algebra 1 and English 1 assessment data as a statewide assessment under standardized testing conditions fully before we are modeling. It's consistent with the best practices in our modeling and checking for validity before fully including in the accountability framework. This cycle also aligns with our timeline for the next time we will identify comprehensive support schools or schools that are in the bottom 5%. You all may remember that in our SSA plan, we said we would identify those schools every 3 years. So the next time we would look at which schools are in the bottom 5% would be in the 2020, would be from the data from the 2020-2021 school year, which aligns then with this cycle, so that we were incorporating growth as we were determining which schools were considered the most struggling and most in need of support. The impact of the proposal on student testing, we wanted to share with you all where our current data is, and I will note that this chart is a proxy. This is based on the students in the 9th grade who took Algebra 1 and English 1 in the 17-18 school year. Obviously, there are some students who would take these assessments not in the 9th grade, because you take the assessment, if the LEA is choosing to give it, they would choose to give it to the students who are in that course in whatever year they take it. So some students may be taking Algebra 1 in 10th grade or even 11th grade, so they would not be counted here, but just as a proxy for how we are actually seeing, even as an optional assessment, a lot of our students taking this test, we have offered this table here. So you can see for Algebra 1, we've seen about 2,700 students across all grades 9 to 12 take that test, about almost 2,800 take the test across all grades, almost 2,700 take it in grade 9, and so that means about 41% of all 9th graders took the Algebra 1 test. And for English 1, you can see the same numbers, about 53%. So about half of 9th graders are already taking Algebra 1 and English 1, and presumably with this year and next year as well, so this is not a change in the student experience for that half of our students. It would be a change in the student experience for the other half.
So in other words, these 41% are taking it, but your descriptions are taking it under non-standardized test conditions.
I should say that we don't require the same test security measures and the same level of scrutiny on our end in terms of monitoring for those test security procedures, because this is an optional test right now, not a required state assessment.
Can I ask a related question, which is, so you're saying right now schools can test students, but it's usually when they're taking, like it would be 10th grade if they're taking Algebra 1 in 10th grade or 11th. And what you're saying is, starting this next school year, all schools will be testing kids in Algebra 1 in 9th grade?
No,
Okay.
sorry. What I'm saying is right now, the required state assessments are Geometry and English 2.
Yeah.
And the federal requirement, as you all will remember, is you have to be tested at least once in high school. And so that, whenever you take the geometry course, you take the geometry test. Whenever you take the English 2 course, you take the English 2 test. What we're saying is, starting next year, we would add a requirement also for Algebra 1 and English 1. So whenever you take Algebra 1, you take that test as well. When you take geometry, you would still take that test. And so, what this is showing us to Ruth's point is that about half of our schools have already been requiring their students to take Algebra 1 and English 1. It's just that that requirement is coming out of an LEA level decision versus an OSSE decision. Some LEAs also choose to optionally give Algebra 2 and English 2. That's a much smaller number, but some LEAs just want the data and the information that comes from having their students sit for a high quality test.
So another question, so 41% of kids are already taking the Algebra 1 test in 9th grade, but some of them would never be taking Algebra 1 in 9th grade because that's not their course. So
That's right.
So how does the growth then work for them?
So the reason this 41% is here is as a proxy for showing that a substantial number of students are already taking Algebra 1. Because we don't have course level data, we don't know how many students across the city were enrolled in Algebra 1. we know that most of the students who take Algebra 1 take it in the 9th grade, and we know that 41% of 9th graders took the Algebra 1 test. So we know that a substantial portion of our students who this requirement would apply to are already meeting the requirement. Does that make sense?
I would say we already also currently have pathways for students. For example, if you take Algebra 1 in 8th grade and geometry in 9th grade, or if you take algebra and geometry in elementary, there are pathways for you to take a different assessment, and those sort of edge case pathways are still the same. We would not change the rules for those. Those options would still be available to students in the same way as they are currently today.
Yeah,
so
that's a good
that wouldn't change if you're taking essentially like Algebra 2 as your course in high school because you've taken all the other ones already. That would still be applicable in the future year as well.
So basically, if there's a middle school where a class of students is taking Algebra 1 in 7th grade, and then they take geometry in 8th grade, and then those students take Algebra 2 in 9th grade, because of how our assessment participation policy already takes into account federal requirements. So it means that kids have to take a test while they're in 7th grade, they take the Algebra 1 test that year. Kids have to take a test while they're in 8th grade, they take the geometry test that year, and then kids have to test at least once in high school, so they take the Algebra 2 test when they get to high school. Oh, in terms of whether they would get included in growth, we are not able to include those edge case pathways. We can only include pathways where there's a substantial enough number of students.
Oh, so they won't have any growth at all from 8 to 9 because it's not enough.
That's right, because there's not enough kids who are in that specific pathway, right, who are taking Algebra 1 in that way. I believe that's correct.
And right now it's like very insubstantial. It wouldn't like impact.
It's quite small numbers. These are why the technical validity checks matter, but based on what we've seen in terms of just our numbers and what it takes for measuring growth, there are definitely enough students in the most common pathways, which are taking 8th grade math in 8th grade, Algebra 1 in 9th grade, and geometry in 10th grade.
It's my question, but it's my understanding that there are multiple high school pathways as well. A traditional pathway, which most schools follow algebra, then geometry, so on and so forth. But there's also a hybrid approach where there's kind of like a mixing of standards across. And one question is, to your understanding, how many schools, if any, are following like a hybrid approach? And then if they are following that approach, when would they actually take the assessment at the end of the course or somewhere during the process of the blending of the?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's called Integrated Math 1, Integrated Math 2, and Integrated Math 3. And basically the way it works is it covers all the same standards as Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2 by the end of the 3 years. But as you said, the order of that is different. And so there are assessments that are available for Integrated Math 1, 2, and 3 that we make available to those schools. They follow the requirement to take one required course in high school right now. So one required test.
And so similar to the advanced middle school students, with those scores not count as well?
Not in growth, they do count for achievement. And I should say those edge cases in middle school, they're still counted for achievement when we report it out. They're just not able to be included in growth because growth requires a certain substantial number of students to be able to compare it to.
I'm curious as to, you said LEAs are making the decisions. With 53% of English 1 students taking that test, I assume then that DCPS is already administering that.
DCPS does it, yeah, as you heard from Principal Tukeda, right, who testified, and a number of charter LEAs also actually administer.
And on algebra, it's not DCPS, it's just a group of charters?
No, it's DCPS for both.
So this is basically codifying what DCPS is already doing?
Yes.
And not what the charters are doing?
About half the charters actually also participate already. The 9th grade number, we've had the same question about the discrepancy. Again, without course level data right now, it's harder to know exactly what the discrepancy is, but some of that may be driven by the students who take Algebra 1 in middle school, right, who would not need to then take it in high school. Because there are some 9th graders who are on that path.
So along the same lines.
And also, I'm sorry to break in, I should also say that our understanding is from DCPS that generally they're giving it to all their students who are in Algebra 1 and English 1. We're not as sure for the charters. They may be choosing to just give it to a few students.
So I get why the 41% is a low number because everybody's not on that path. presumably virtually everybody is on the English 1 in 9th grade now. So how can the 53% represent Jack's point, all the kids in DCPS and half the kids in charters?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that it is pretty standard, but we still see some students not in 9th grade taking the English 1 test. So even the English courses do not always line up exactly with what we anticipate. And we see that on our English 2 assessment in particular, where we report out statewide, not everybody's in 10th grade when they take it. So that could be driving some of it. And then as I said, with the charter LEAs who are participating, it's not necessarily all of their students who are taking it. It may be a subset for whatever reason.
Some charters are bigger or smaller, so the proportion of
So the big
schools
impact
versus.
on additional test taking.
That's right.
Dr. Sutter's not here, but she had a couple questions, so I wanted to ask those.
Sure.
She'll probably watch it later. So, just 3 short ones. Can I just rapid fire them to you?
Yeah.
So the first is, why did OSSE see this model preferable to a school level value added model? 2, have LEAs had a chance to see the report code for additional testing requirements, and if so, how they reacted? If not, when will they be notified? And then 3, how will this compare to what other states are doing with respect to high school growth?
Yeah. So on the value added, we looked at this, and I should say I came from Tennessee where we used this SBOE model. It was like a deep part of our work there, and I've been there for like 20 years. So I'm familiar with the work and certainly have understand the value of it. Value added, as I mentioned before, right now in our elementary and middle schools, we have both a normative measure and a criterion reference measure. And we wanted to include both for different reasons. So normative measures look at schools' growth relative to one another, right? So it's which schools relatively made more growth and less growth. Criterion reference measures look at growth against a standard, in our case, growth up to a level of efficiency. And I think both matter for different reasons. In some cases, yes, we want to acknowledge growth that students are making in any case, but ultimately, I think we all want our students to graduate ready for college and careers, right? So we want to see that ultimately the improvement is not just like a little bit each year, or hopefully at least each year, but that it's leading up to the point that you want it to. And so the growth to proficiency measure gives schools credit who are making enough growth that their students should get to a level of proficiency over the next 5 years. And the other difference between the normative and criterion reference is the normative measure recognizes the schools that do better and worse than each other when it comes to growth in any given year. And so in a year that, let's say, DC made amazing gains, right? As a whole, the whole city made incredible leaps and bounds. It would still give a differentiation between the schools that made slightly less amazing gains and the schools that made slightly more amazing gains. Whereas growth to and so the schools that had slightly less amazing gains may have made tremendous progress, but they would actually do less well on that metric because by nature it's a distribution. Conversely, in a year where DC, let's say, did terribly, where we did a terrible job and our results were awful, not all of a sudden happens, but in that year you would still recognize the schools that had done a less terrible job and schools that had done, and so MGP is always going to show a distribution among our schools, which is helpful in some ways in recognizing differences, but is a different thing than the criterion reference where in the year where everyone did amazing, everyone could score well on growth to proficiency. All schools could get full credit on that theoretically if they were knocking out the park that much. And then in a year where everyone did badly, the growth to proficiency metric would show actually almost none of us are actually doing a good enough job to get our students up to the level of proficiency. So they tell two different pictures around growth and improvement. This is all like the way of saying value added on its own does not meet sort of both those measures. So that's one reason why we didn't select it. And the other reason is it really does not fit easily into the structure of our system as we've constructed it. The main reason for value added in other places, including Tennessee, is that value added gives you more options to take into account the circumstances of students who are similar to the students you're looking at for a particular moment. So there's control for student demographics, for income levels, etc. Our system already does that because we have built in subgroup frameworks where we look at the performance of students with disabilities relative to other students with disabilities, at-risk students relative to other at-risk students. So there's not an easy way to plug in. Our system basically already does what value added tries to account for, and to plug in value added is not easy to do because it would categories around value added. The second question was around whether LEAs have had a chance to weigh in. We have shared this as a proposal with LEAs. We wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything we hadn't taken into consideration. We are planning this week to communicate with them that this is the direction we're planning to go in, that we are going in for this upcoming school year. And the three big things we heard from LEAs were, one, to recognize that next school year, the 2020 school year, will be the first year that we're doing Algebra 1 and English 1 as a required assessment. For some of them, it will be the first time they're ever giving that test. And that's very different from other assessments where it will be the 6th year we've been doing it. And they just asked us to be thoughtful about that as we report out on results next summer, which I think makes a lot of sense. It's factually true. It is important context that we need to keep in mind. That's the first time we're looking into this. The second thing we heard from them was that they would like additional instructional supports at the secondary level. And that's true across the board, but particularly in these two subject areas where it will be newer for them. And so that is something we have been taking into account. We have a division of teaching and learning that's pretty new at OSSE. We are really excited about some of the new and expanded instructional supports we are rolling out for this upcoming school year, and we've made a particular point on making sure to emphasize secondary and Algebra 1 and English 1 in particular. And the third area of feedback was...
How does this compare with what other states are doing?
Oh, yes. So the... sorry, I'm just looking at my notes.
I'm sorry, on other states. Sorry,
Yes.
I've got too many pieces of paper in front of me.
I think there's something like 15 other states that currently have...
Yep.
16 states that currently have a growth component in use in their high school accountability system. Alabama, Arkansas, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Massachusetts, Michigan, Mississippi, New Mexico, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Tennessee, Utah, and Wyoming. So that's the most updated information that we could find on incorporating in the user growth in high schools.
Model in terms of your model, how is, I don't know, you might not have this, but how does that compare to other states?
Yeah, we don't have it offhand. We can follow up with it, but I think the most common models are MGP, some level of growth through proficiency, or value added. So I think that all three of those are represented in that answer system.
Question I have, with the addition of the Algebra and English 1 assessments, considering schools' technology, infrastructure, and bandwidth, like how either are assessment windows going to be adjusted, and or are there going to be supplemental resources for schools?
Yeah,
to accommodate?
It's a great question. I think our assessment team is looking forward to digging in more with LEA assessment folks to fully understand this. The assessment window is pretty long already as a state, so I don't anticipate that changing, but schools could adjust their testing windows, obviously. LEAs right now take a small fraction of the total state assessment window to do their testing. And I think in terms of the impact on the testing window, it will really vary by LEA. There are some LEAs, again, many LEAs are already doing this, right? So for them, very little change. For some LEAs, they may not be giving it, but may have sufficient technology that they can keep their window the same and still test the same number of students. In other cases, they may just have enough technology right now within their current window for the one assessment, and so by adding the other, they may need to look at extending their window. But because the situations are so differentiated, I think it'll take ongoing conversations with the assessment folks. And I should say we've talked with both LEA leaders and assessment folks around this, so I've started to hear some of the questions and those issues. I do have just one more slide that I wanted to share with you all in terms of just an overview of other test progressions we considered before planning on this decision. So one area that we heard about was, actually before I go into the rows, let me just talk through the columns. So I mentioned at the beginning that we have a real commitment at OSSE to ensuring we have high quality assessments that accurately measure student learning. And for us, one of the biggest core components of our high quality assessment is demonstrating clear alignment to our state standards, right? Our state standards are what should be taught, and our assessments need to be aligned to those state standards. The second criteria we used was the idea of giving schools credit for more students. So looking at how schools are serving students and trying to give them credit for looking at more students within their building. Right now, for example, in middle schools, we are capturing almost all students sort of within their accountability measures, whereas in high schools, we are not capturing as many. And so this would be a chance to look at more students within the accountability framework. And then finally, this idea of clearly attributing student growth accurately accurately and precisely to schools. So taking account of those student mobility issues and making sure we're capturing that growth in as technically sound a manner as possible. So those are sort of the three biggest criteria we used as we were evaluating these proposals. There were a couple of others, but these are the main ones. And so then the rows are the different options we considered. So one test progression we could look at was PSAT to SAT. As you all know, we give SAT consistently. This would be adding PSAT as a big assessment in this scenario. But we did not feel like that demonstrated sufficiently alignment to state standards. SAT actually recently went through the U.S. Department of Education's peer review process and was given the second lowest rating out of 4 possible ratings and was specifically dinged around their alignment to the Common Core state standards. They were also dinged for their accessibility and accommodations features, which is really concerning, obviously, for our students with disabilities and English learners. And so we did not feel like that was a viable pathway. It also, PSAT and SAT would not give schools credit for more students. PSAT is, we already use SAT as counted in the accountability framework. PSAT is generally given in the 10th grade. We already capture most 10th graders through geometry. And it also does not solve our student growth issues in the same way. We looked at also just 8th grade parked geometry, so doing that 2-year time span. There we do have the alignment to state standards, but it does not, again, give schools credit for more students. And the biggest issue for me is that last column of clearly attributing student growth to schools. So as you heard, 2 years is more ambiguous. We'd have to drop out all the students who are mobile. That's a substantial portion of our students, and often some of our more vulnerable students, so we do not want to do that. And then we thought about, should we just change from Geometry and English 2 to Algebra 1 and English 1, and then look at growth from 8th grade to Algebra 1 and English 1. So again, it meets the alignment to state standards. It does clearly attribute student growth to schools, but it does not cover more students. It just switches out which students we look at. It also, I think this one has the flaw of, if we just change our state assessment, we would essentially lose, we've now, after this spring, after the summer, we will have 5 years of consistent data around geometry and English 2, and we would lose that ability to look longitudinally at that data over time. It would be like we were starting over with Algebra 1 and English 1 as if we were wholesale changing our assessment, which is a real loss of other investment and all the support that all of the work that our educators have done on this matter. So you can see ultimately we landed on this, our decision to do Part 8 to Algebra 1 and English 1, Algebra 1 and English 1 to Geometry and English 2, which meets all 3 of these 4 criteria for us. And then I think what's still to come, as I noted, is the further discussions with you all and with LEAs and others around what exactly this would mean for the high school framework itself. So we need to do the modeling, again, that's around the technical growth measures, but we also need to make decisions around where would we attribute the points, right? How would we want to break out the achievement points between Algebra 1 and Geometry? Would we want to weight them equally? Would we want to weight them differently? How do we want to look at the points between achievement and growth? We have more measures in high school than we do in elementary and middle school. We have grad rate that's required. We have extended year grad rate. We have APIB, participation and performance. So there's not an exact parallel to what's happening in elementary and middle, so there's going to be a lot of judgment calls that we will make together. And we are looking forward to lots more engagement and discussions around those points. And again, there will be a vote before this board and approval by the U.S. Department of Education before we actually implement those changes on the high school framework.
A really huge hypothetical. If somewhere down the line our state assessment changes, would that be a substantive change? State board would have to make it, and what does that mean for growth measures moving forward?
I believe that the selection of the assessment would not be a substantive change in terms of the accountability definitions, I think, but it certainly would be a really big change for education as a community, and I can't imagine we would ever make that kind of change without any discussions with all of the related stakeholders.
I was just, for sure I understand that, I was just trying to figure out whether a change in the assessment was sound our ability to count growth.
I mean, it would change everything. Like, we'd have to reset all our achievement stuff. It would having watched the states go through this, like, it would blow up a lot of things, and which is why we never make that kind of change in an unconsidered matter. We would always want to plan very carefully for it.
And also, like, specifically, growth is a metric that takes much more time because you need to show students moving from place to place to place with enough. So that's actually one of the earliest things impacted when you make a change in assessment is the growth, because you need information over time, which is actually one of the reasons we didn't include it when we got the OSSE plan approved, is that we didn't have enough data to model it even then after we had done it just a couple of years by the time we got the plan approved. So yeah, that's the right instinct.
So I appreciate you coming with this very well thought out. I know that your team has invested a lot of time and energy in this, and I appreciate that we'll have further discussions over the next year. I have a couple points I wanted to raise. It feels to me a little bit like the Bowser administration is again proposing the forest charters to come in line with DCPS practices rather than allowing them to be innovation labs, as Zachary hinted at earlier with the math 1, 2, and 3. This is once again proposing additional assessments when the board's leadership has been consistent in arguing that students are already over-tested and crowding out time for instruction and learning. And the proposal requires additional testing for all students next year when there is no indication that this board would support forcing our students to take additional assessments and tests. And finally, this proposes that our students be forced into additional testing at a time, to your point, in 9th grade when they are most vulnerable to dropping out. So those are some things that I hope we can talk about over the next couple of months.
Yeah, I would just say a couple of things in response. So first, in terms of stifling innovation, I think as you heard actually in the response to Zachary, that we already allow for the integrated math 1, 2, 3 test progression. In part, and frankly, it's not easy to do. It's another assessment that's developed for a quite small number of students, but it's done because we do want to allow for flexibility wherever possible. There are also places where the reason that we mandate certain things is so that we have consistent data and information right across the board. And so yes, it is a careful balance to strike between where we require some things across all schools versus where we allow for flexibility. We think in this case that it makes sense that the balance weighs in favor of requiring this assessment. But it is something we've taken into account, and I would say we always try and do these things in a way that still allows for as much flexibility as possible. We also have adopted state standards, right, that require the teaching about normal and geometry and algebra too, and so this is a way of measuring. When it comes to the student experience, I would say, again, as you've seen, about half of our students are already participating in these state assessments, and one way to think about this is that means the public is investing funds in our students and our educators spending time on these assessments, and yet we have not had a public view into those assessments up until now because they've been given optionally. And so I think it will spark some really important conversations across the city about how our students are doing at an earlier point in time, and that feels important and relevant to us as well.
It does, unless folks are leaving KCPS because they feel like their children are already over-tested and going to charters because there's fewer assessments.
I think there's a lot of assumptions built into that I don't feel like I have information to share.
Yeah, that's why I'm glad we're going to be talking.
Yeah.
Continue to talk.
And then finally, I think what I would share in terms of where's the last point raised?
The student experience in 9th grade or additional testing when we're not sure.
Yes. So what I was going to say is I think as you've seen, this was not a decision we came to lightly, and I think we've heard really consistently from this board around the importance of getting to a growth measure. We genuinely believe that this is the best possible path to get to that growth measure, and that's something we know we've heard your feedback around and community feedback around. If we thought there was a different viable option, we would have brought that forward. You can see here in the middle 2 rows on this chart the 2 options that would keep the amount of required state testing the same, and why we don't believe that they are the most feasible option here. And so there are just trade-offs to any decision. In our view, this was the correct trade-off to make.
Others? No. So I have a few questions. I want to start with something that Jack said on the testing, because I do worry about the over-testing. I am a total believer in the end-of-year test. I don't care how many days I started in first grade. What I'm totally against is all of the in-between stuff, all the test prep, all the interim tests, all the this, that, and everything else that LEAs and schools put on their classrooms to do all this stuff. And I really strongly think that as we do this, that it would be in your interest as well as everybody's interest to do what great city schools recommended and did in many parts of the country
a great point, and in addition to Council of Great City Schools, I know there are other organizations and other places that have produced these tools that allow for an assessment of a review of all your assessments that you use. And I think one of the most important things is to make sure that each one of them has a clear purpose. A summative, standardized end-of-year assessment, I agree with you, it's absolutely critical. It provides that consistent data and information across the whole city or whole state. And it also is not a tool for instruction by its very nature, right? Or it can inform some instructional planning for the upcoming year, look at students' broad strengths and gaps, but doesn't serve the same purpose as a formative or interim assessment. Sometimes, which I think are used for test prep, as you said, and in other cases really are used to inform instruction and interventions along the way. So I think these tools are often designed to really help LEAs take an inventory in a way that they themselves may not have realized how much these assessments have piled on each other, and make sure that any assessment they use, they've really thought about what is the value of this and how are they using it within their own context. So I think it's a point really well taken, where we should look at sort of what is available and make that point.
I mean, I think it would help LEAs sort of revisit what they're doing, and I think it would help parents understand, insofar as they're all necessary, why, and insofar as they're not, help create, some real movement to listen.
I have a quick thing on the superintendent's point there, would be to make sure that we get someone from DCPS with decision-making authority who's in charge of these assessments to give us a real conversation about why they're proctoring the test and why it's important to DCPS. It's really hard to make these determinations if a representative who's empowered does not choose to come to testify before us. I think that's really important.
I think it would be great to have them come.
I think it's critical. Otherwise, I don't think there's any reason to move forward with a proposal like this without the LEA that's giving the most of these assessments to not come and testify before us on the importance of those would be a real problem.
I'm all for that. I also think that's one piece of it. I mean, the other piece of it, because I think this is very true. Yes, I think it's true in lots of places. People on top have wonderful reasons for everything they do. By the time it gets down to the classroom, what it looks like and how it's used is very different. So even if we had someone come and explain all the great things that all these do, you need to understand how it's really playing out and sort of figure out what to do. So I totally. Second question, which relates to growth in high school, but also all the way through. We've heard from multiple people, and I believe 2 people on our different panels agreed with this, and one person didn't. I forget the numbers. Which is this critique that I hear very often is that PARC does not pick up growth at the bottom of the achievement levels because it's not adaptive. It's mainly at the grade level, and we got some different views from people. How would you respond to that? Can we get a formal answer to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I can share what I think now, and we can think about what we want to know. So one thing is, in terms of, we went through, PARC was submitted as part of this really rigorous peer review process that the U.S. Department of Education runs that all state assessments have to go through. And PARC scored at I mentioned the SAT was rated at the bottom, second from the lowest of 4 possible levels. PARC met the highest criteria, top out of the 4 possible, and which looks at a bunch of elements of technical validity, including your scale and how it's set and how it picks up performance at different levels. So I don't want to overstate sort of all the parts of that review, but I know that it was sort of rigorously looked at on all these different measures of what a strong assessment looks like, and that is a peer review process. So it's not done by ed employees, it's done by other experts.
Is that a public document or document?
I think the results of the ratings are public, but I don't believe the full review is posted publicly. I think we can share ours though. It's a gigantic packet, but
we hear so much about that.
Sure, yeah.
There's an argument to be made.
Yeah, around the technical review. The other thing I want to say is you mentioned adaptive assessments and how PARC is a grade level assessment. The reality is actually that all state assessments are required, that are for the federal purposes, are required to be assessing grade level standards. That's a core part of the peer review process, whether they are adaptive or not. So one of the things we have heard as we've talked to other states that have used adaptive designs is actually that they, the picture people have in their heads of what adaptive assessments look like often view of the student's performance against the grade level content. And as a result, the assessments often are not shorter. Sometimes they are even longer because of that, because you're doing a little bit below and above, but also still having to do all the grade level. And second, again, it's may pick up a little bit more, but it still has to be primarily grade level content. So it's been a learning for me too around how adaptive design works in different state contexts. Often what ends up happening is states, it's not item adaptive the way we think. It's not like you answer one question based on whether it's right or wrong, the next question is different. It often ends up being blocks of content. So it'll be, you take 20 questions, depending on how you do on those 20 questions, you might get a slightly harder or slightly easier next block of 20 or 30 questions. So it's not as different as we might think it is. It's also not easy to do well.
I still have two more, but I don't want to hog it from people.
Question, but connected to that, Ruth, and feel free to chime in, but schools are providing information about where students are below proficiency, so at the different levels or tiers, and there are high schools, at least in Ward 5, that are tracking in-house at least how many students they're moving from level 1 to level 2, 2 to 3, so on and so forth, even if that is below that watermark or benchmark level. I have heard that with PARC there are different suites of tools that you can purchase, and there are some other districts that I've heard have packages where schools get more information around like student level data. I don't know how true or different that is, but a trend that I've heard is that many schools are not getting a ton of valuable student level data as much as it's like aggregate level. And is that going to change at all? Is that accurate to your opinion?
Yeah, so there is not more data available in other places. It may be available in a different format than it's available here, but not with more data. And all of the same data that any other district is getting, we are providing to all LEAs. I think there's a challenge around that data, that individual student data, taking it from the LEA to the school and the educator level.
Gotcha.
Say also, our assessment team offers workshops and technical assistance to schools and LEAs, and many have taken us up on it to actually have a better sense of what is available, how you might actually take something from a big package of data into actual use at the instructional level with your learning team in 5th grade to talk about what our strengths and weaknesses are in teaching English language arts, for example. We know that for a lot of, not everybody takes us up on it, but that is available, that OSSE provides.
Available to individual schools?
Yeah, we'll do it with whoever wants.
Yeah, and so our teams go out to individual schools or to LEAs over the summer to talk to their teachers. We always make that offer. We'll make this offer publicly available to anyone who's listening or other teachers or schools that you talk to, because it's not always like an obvious, it's not always easy for teachers who might be very strong in their content area, but it's not as natural as a skill and assessment. But we always want to make that available to people, so I promote that opportunity.
Say that again, that's to learn how to use the assessment to understand your kids.
So the information that you get from the assessment, and then how you use that in an instructional way and in planning and thinking for your teachers and your students in your school.
And I will say that I have not, obviously, I've only sat in on it a couple of times, but anytime I've sat in on that workshop, the people tend to be blown away by how much information is publicly available, not just available within the LEA setting, around the assessment design and how informative that is. So we're more than happy.
So you do that at the school level?
We do that out of invitation. Anyone who invites us out, school, LEA.
So my next thing really is about sort of the timelines on it. And I know we'll talk about this more, but it'd be great if we could do this a year earlier. I was at the National Assembly Plans hearing this morning, and part of what is really very concerning is how everybody is talking about how we're gonna, we're building schools based on star ratings. So people are building schools and making decisions about the quality of schools based on these star ratings, and for the high schools, there's not even growth in it. So the idea that we would wait 3 more years, I really worry about that. So just put that out there. We have data from 2% of the kids. I wonder if I hear what you're saying about wanting to be super careful about the this is gonna come due, start to go on the report. It'll essentially be the, as you're laying it out, be the first new thing in the new round of ratings. That is, there was gonna be a set of 3 ratings and then a review. So this is, we're now saying is gonna be how we'll do that 4th test, the 4th rating, right?
Year 4.
Year 4. So it seems to me that part of what we all agreed on was that before we got to that 4th year, we were gonna have a thorough review of the whole rating system. So I just wanna get some sense from you about how we're gonna do that, because I guess it's upon us, really what you're saying, is that to have things ready to go in year 4, we need to be putting them into plans and timelines and thinking about them now.
So I appreciate the push, and believe me, I also take this question because I share your impatience. That said, I think that it really, certainly my team convinced me, which is why it's here before you as this timeline, that there's not a responsible way to try and do this a year sooner, particularly around incorporating both years of growth. So you can see here that this is quite aggressive actually on trying to get to incorporate both years. It means that in summer 2020, we can look at the growth from grade 8th grade to Algebra 1 and English 1. And it's not until the following summer that we can actually look at the growth from Algebra 1 and English 1 to Geometry and English 2. So the same students will not have gone through that progression. And so it's, to me, this is the fastest possible timeline on which we could move. And it also, to Shauna's point, like, I hear you on the need for the more comprehensive review, and like I would say we're not far off from it, but the reason that not all aspects of it, I would say, are as upon us as quickly is just growth, because it requires these 2 years of assessment, because you don't want to spring a new assessment on people mid-school year, right? That's not fair. It all requires really careful planning. That it's sort of the most extended time frame of any decision we would make as opposed to other things. And so that's, I think, the reason why this timeline felt particularly urgent to get in place for the fall 2021. I think for other things we have just a little bit more time, not a ton, but a little bit.
But that would be the plan, that sort of, I guess, maybe a year from now, that we'd be looking at a full refresher.
Yeah, I was trying to remember. I know, like, generally we, of course, want to do that. I can't remember what the specific commitments we had made in writing were around the full review. But we can pull those up
Yes,
and
those are
try and
the
make sure we
ones
get to a
that-
plan with our meetings as well.
Anybody else? Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
I just want to say, I think on behalf of all of us, that I know there was some concern about whether you could come forward with a proposal, and we really appreciate that you did. And we'll be chewing on it and have some questions. And I'm glad we did receptivity on doing that study review, how we can do that, and how we can help you do that.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think Dr. Sutter also just wanted.
Jessica, you on?
She may be still on the plane, so.
Oh, I see. So she's sort of in and out.
Yeah.
Is that- All right.
Hi guys, I am still on the plane, so I'm listening, but I won't be able to say much.
Okay.
Well, hi. Sorry about your delay. Okay.
You're saying your neighbor on the plane doesn't want to hear all of this?
They probably don't want to hear the high school growth model for Washington DC, no they don't, but that's okay.
So now we are off schedule, and to some extent we may pick up sometime, and the other extent is we may go late. So there we go. Okay. So let me the next thing up is Zachary and his proposal, and let me just say this about it. Zachary can reject any of this, but he and I know he and a lot of people have been in touch and talking about things. I sent out the resolution earlier today, and I'm sorry it didn't go out earlier, but that was my effort to sort of start to incorporate into the general working group some of what's going on in Zachary's proposal. And so we sort of have two things. I think maybe they'll end up being one, maybe they'll end up being two. I don't think that's completely figured out, but the conversation people should know it's substantive around both. Is that fair?
Yes. I think that's.
So, I mean, I think this first part is to focus on what Zachary has said, but at the same, but at the same time, know that the other resolution that you have, it's sort of, we're working off of each other to some extent.
So I would just quickly frame to say there's been a lot of conversation. In short, the resolution is in your folder. And the goal is for us to complete a research project in its most simplest form, where we will investigate three things. The first of which is the extent to which LEAs and schools are teaching and administering our standards related to our core content areas, ELA, math, science, social studies. We already know all of our schools are teaching math and ELA, so that is a no-brainer. Really the focus there would be the extent to which schools are teaching science and social studies. There's a lot of rumor that many schools are not. We know some schools are doing a hybrid approach, however we don't have hard data. The second thing this task force would seek to investigate is the extent to which classroom assignments and tasks meet grade level expectations. This is something I'm really passionate about, especially through an equity lens, because we know students at risk, low-income students especially, must be challenged. They are often behind grade level, and that is only compounded by instruction that is not challenging them and meeting them at grade level. And so that would be done explicitly through a series of class observations that we would contract out for. That is not, the hope is not that the board would do that work. Obviously, we will work alongside whoever we would contract with, and there would be a robust observation process throughout the district. And the third thing that the task force would seek to investigate is the extent to which teachers and leaders feel as though they are supported to know, implement, and grapple with our learning standards. That simply could possibly be done through a survey of sorts, also through a round of in-person interviews. I'm thinking more likely a survey. And so that's the task force before everyone. Just a few other things. I'm hoping that we can vote on this at our board meeting this month with the expectation that the convening of the task force wouldn't take place until September. In that interim, there would be a lot of groundwork happening around budgets, contracting with someone to help us do this work. I personally am open to there being a task force where there are stakeholders from across the city, from the charter board, from DCPS, from OSSE, as well as some school-based personnel to ensure that this is a citywide conversation. And then the other big point of conversation has been around money and resources. I have had conversations with Ruth about that. Since my last talk with the working group, the working group, I was able to reach out to the folk at TNTP to just ask them, like, how much did it cost you? They did say it was in the millions of dollars for them to conduct their research project, but keeping in mind that they also did work across many large districts. I believe there were 5, and they gave a figure of $50,000. However, my question back to them, which I have not gotten an answer in response, was whether that $50,000 was from one content area, multiple content areas, and so that is a question that I'm left wondering. They did say that they have resources available for districts who are interested in doing this type of research, as well as there are 2 approaches that one might follow. One is to contract out with someone to do the work. The other is a train the model or a trained observer type of approach, which I'll admit I'm hesitant about, which essentially you would get a central entity to train ordinary folk or educators to go into classrooms to make judgments about rigor and quality of assignment. So I would just say that's been the latest update that I have since our conversation in the work.
My first thing I'll just say, I'll be very interested to hear what they did for 50K. That's what TNTP did that cost 50K.
Well, they did, again, what they did cost millions. They said they believe districts, they have a model and they believe districts can replicate it on a smaller scale for roughly 50K. When I asked whether or not that might cover 4 content areas, which is again what we're hoping to do, they didn't have an answer for that.
So what were they thinking it would?
They did not. I'm waiting.
They haven't responded.
They have not responded. Well, it was, I don't have an answer. I'm going to do some research and get back to you, but I have not heard back.
But I mean, the quote, the estimate of 50K is based on 2 content areas, or?
Again, that was my question.
And they were just like, oh, we don't know. That's odd. I mean, that's kind of.
I believe their research was in math and ELA.
Yeah.
And so I would imagine, my gut is telling me that that $50,000 figure is for math and ELA.
So what do you, would this be looking at both math and ELA?
It would be looking at, and so that's up for the board to determine. Right now, we have all 4 listed: math, ELA, science, and social studies. There have been conversations with the working group of maybe we prioritize and start with K through 5, K through 8, maybe we look at only high school, maybe we only look at certain content areas. I think that's something that we can grapple with and figure out.
I think the motivation, and I would presume your original intent was to make sure that it was a more comprehensive and it attached science and social studies, and so figuring out how to scale it, you know.
I think that's right. I would be open to like starting at a smaller pool. So for instance, we look at K through 5, for instance, and use that as a starting place, but looking across all 4 content areas.
I'm also concerned about how limited the task force can have access to information that would inform kind of broader, right, citywide discussion on how we make sure the schools are adhering to it. Will be limited if we do it kind of in a smaller vacuum. Is there like, do you have any thoughts about
What do you mean limited? Like our conclusions might be.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think one of the constraints is going to come down to money. Obviously, we have a lot of money now, thanks to Ruth and Marcus and team. I know, I'm teasing. I am also open to seeking money external from the board. I know there are some board members that are hesitant to that. That is also a point of conversation we can have. But I think whatever the work is will come down to the amount of money we have to do it.
I think, so one thing we talked about. Oh. Hi, Jessica.
Yeah, hi, how are you? My car. Let me ask this. One thing that I'm just still a little unclear on is how this work integrates in with the 2 other working groups that it should intersect with.
Right.
One of those being the well-rounded education group.
Thank you.
And the other one being the social studies standards working group. And that social studies survey that is still out, that is already being administered to teachers and folks around the city, which will have some initial data. I just feel like there's a lot of moving parts, and I'd love to understand how you're thinking about them moving and working together rather than being duplicative.
Great question. There has been some conversation there. I don't want to speak for Ruth and Emily, but it is my understanding, at least, that we are open to exploring for there to be some overlap. The well-rounded working group is agreeing to continue to keep the train going, Even, again, keeping in mind that this task force, should it be implemented, would not assemble until September. And then at that time, it would essentially be a pulling of whatever data we have available to us. So for instance, if you already have sent out the social studies survey, that's one less thing that this group has to collect because we have that data available. Likewise, there has been conversation, at least in my understanding, that perhaps Emily and me might join forces on this type of project, combining where it makes sense, the efforts of that working group and this task force. So the short of it is everything has not been figured out how we would mesh that. I think that's to Ruth's point with her resolution, trying to think about how all this comes together, but there has been some initial conversation and I think people are open to that. I don't want to speak.
Jessica, I was just about to, I don't know if it's a question or not, but I'll just, it really touches on what you asked. In that, in our last conversation, in the working group, a question that came up is, what is the objective here? Like, what are, and that will obviously inform the kind of research that we do, right? Like how we design this. And so one thing that we talked about was sort of making this exploratory in that we're trying to first, I mean, the way I'm thinking about it as I'm trying to think of how these pieces go together is sort of concentric circles of broadness versus specificity. So first, the first widest, broadest circle would be, are schools teaching these subjects, right? Are they teaching social studies? Are they teaching science? And then what Zachary's bringing up is, okay, assuming they're teaching them, are they teaching at grade level, right? And then the piece that I kind of want to get at, that I feel like we haven't talked about really, is, are we really preparing kids for, college, career, and life in like 21st century skills, right? So I feel like what you're looking at, or what Zachary's proposing, is looking at content and grade level content, right? But that doesn't necessarily, might correlate with quality of experiences kids are being exposed to, or it may not. There isn't necessarily a correlation there. So that's the piece I feel like is more specific, and it's not, we haven't gotten to that piece yet. But I guess my question to you, Zachary, and to everybody, I mean, thinking about to me, it made sense to pull the, looking at content standards into this working group. It just goes along with it. The part I'm struggling with now is separating, right? Like having its own task force. And that, I still am not clear on why that's necessary. I guess what I'm grappling with ultimately is looking at content, grade level, instruction more important than the other things, or why are we pulling it out? So that's my question.
I wouldn't argue, well, I personally think it is the most important thing, but that's neither here nor there. The idea is not that, this is more important than the work of the working groups. It really comes down to, as I mentioned to others, Fraser and I were very clear early on that we didn't think that it was appropriate to have external people in our working groups, that the working groups were really for board members. And part of this, I really want this to be a district-wide effort to have key stakeholders, and so it would be pretty hypocritical for me to then say, Ruth, although I told you not to bring X person, I now want to have these 5 people around the table. And so I'm calling it a task force, but whether we call it a task force, whether we call it a whatever you want to call it, it's essentially an opportunity to have stakeholders from our sister agencies as well as other.
Right. So it doesn't necessarily, I mean, when you say task force, what that brings to mind for me is an ongoing group of
as
people
it says
who
in the legislation, it would have a start date and a very clear end date. that we would have to sunset the task force, which is by May 2020, if I'm not mistaken, in the
But
legislation.
it involves like the same people convening and sort of working together versus, for instance,
Oh, I
are
see what you're
you
saying.
saying that maybe it would be that, or maybe it would be like, we're going to meet with this agency on this
You know, I
date
think
and-
it's like calling people to a table. I don't necessarily think it has to be a monthly meeting, but calling the same people to the table to guide, direct this work, to provide feedback as the work continues, and then to join the state board when the product is finished to say, we are co-signing the results of this research that the state board.
Okay, one more question, so I actually just,
Yeah.
could it then be focused on well-rounded education in general, as opposed to just focusing on the standards?
To be, with all due respect, I don't really even know what well-rounded I don't know what you mean by well-rounded education
Right.
when you say that.
Right, right. No, I hear you. So I guess, you know, in the task force, in the working group, what I think we're moving towards is trying to figure out how both to assess whether or not schools are providing students with, you know, experiences that, you know, are rich and will prepare them. Because, I mean, it says in,
So,
you know,
I mean,
yeah, go on. And then
Yeah.
I think the objective of what we're doing is really to then be able to advocate for, you know, take what we find to then understand better how to advocate for.
my only concern with that is we have jurisdiction over standards.
Yeah.
Whereas this is not a research project to go into classrooms to judge who's a good teacher or a bad teacher, or what is a good activity versus a bad activity. It's a thin line, but the line is drawn on what meets the expectations of the standards that the state board authorized and what doesn't. So for instance, if you're supposed to teach area using arrays, but you're teaching area using length times width, that does not meet the expectations of the standards that the state board authorized, for example. It's a thin line. So I'm open to that. I just don't know if I'm really clear on.
Yeah, we're not clear on it yet, but yeah, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, I'm sorry. It's that thin line that's bothering me. Because what is the definition of quality that keeps coming up in this proposal? How do you define it?
Aligned to grade level standards is how we would define it.
But I understand that you're trying to align what you're doing to grade level standards. But in order for it to be successful, it has to be quality alignment.
Mhm.
Okay. So how do you judge how do you measure quality?
Alignment to grade level standard. And I'm not being flippant, but I would say we are not judging a good activity versus bad activity. Literally, how many classrooms did we go into and see grade level activities and assignments versus not? And maybe we can adjust the language to be clearer there. And so is this text that you have in your classroom a grade appropriate text, or is it not? Not, is this a good text worth reading or not?
I'm having trouble differentiating that.
So I have two questions. One is when we're talking about the who, and obviously you want to make a task force to convene outside organizations and people. When we created both, since I've been on the board, our past two task forces, we in the resolution put together who would be in the task force. I do think that we should think about that as a group before we convene the task force, as having at least one PCSB member, having one, OSSE, whatever, having 3 parents, whatever, stuff like that. Not
and I wouldn't
as we
want
start to
12 or
think
20
that.
members. I'm thinking more like 5 people, just a representative from the not major, but like OSSE, DCPS, the charter
right,
board,
who we're thinking about and
being clear.
who, making sure we do have a representative sample of organizations and agencies and people across the board in the resolution that everybody could agree to. The other question I have is, once we collect this data, what exactly are the objectives and how do we plan to use this data?
Good question.
What are we, this tells us we're going to have a task force and we're going to collect some data, which is great, but if we're not using it effectively, what's the purpose?
Yes. To your first point, I am meeting with Hansel on the 13th. It is my hope that we can have OSSE to buy in. But yes, I'm in full agreement that we should have printed in the resolution the individuals that would serve on the task force, as well as I would hope we would provide parameters so that it doesn't run away from us, that we set clear guidelines for how that task force is to operate. To your second question, as you know, the state board doesn't have authority to make LEAs do anything. My hope is that we would provide recommendations in our findings, and it would spur LEAs to take action. What I imagine will happen is that the data will say many schools are not teaching all of our core content areas. It will likely say many of our LEAs or classrooms we visited had subpar instruction that did not meet grade level expectations, especially for at-risk students, special needs students, low-income students. And I would imagine that teachers are going to likely say they are not supported in their school environments. And so right now we say that anecdotally or by hearsay, and hopefully we can have a robust data sampling, kind of similar to our teacher retention work, that we can then say definitively, this is what's happening in the district, and we hope you take action on it.
I do think
Through support, not accountability, support.
that objectives should be fully listed in the resolution prior to our
Yep.
vote of what we have what we have made the task force do. So we're spending $50,000 and we say if we're going to spend this money, this is what the task force will give us.
Right.
Yep.
I guess that is also, so as I mentioned, I'm not clear on the objective. I think for the well-rounded education working group in general, my understanding is that our objective is to, have data that helps us to better advocate for, rich curriculum in our schools. I know that's not, directly in our purview, but it is in ESSA. It's a mandate in ESSA that, we're supposed to be ensuring that schools provide that for students. So I guess,
if I had to say, it would be that we would provide LEAs and partners concrete data so that there can be more systematic supports for teachers to learn and implement our standards so that they teach at grade level.
I guess where I'm getting caught though is I feel like, I should say feel like, I know that, standards and content are only part of a bigger picture in terms of all the things
we have
talked about.
jurisdiction
So
over
let me-
standards.
So we have, one of the issues here is we have, I think, overlapping but not exactly the same visions, and so I'm trying to figure out whether they're close enough or, so let me I just want to hold this at this point
Fair
for this
enough.
moment to see who else wants to get in on this.
Right.
Oh, I thought you had something.
Okay. Anybody else?
John Paul, not to put you on the spot, but and all staff as well. I am also wanting to be mindful of staff capacity. I know we've had conversations. And so if you could just speak to staff capacity and what might be the implications of this type of.
Before you do that, can I raise some questions and then kick it? So I do feel like this is getting more and more focused, and I can start to see both the.
Did I win you over?
Well, I like a lot. Here's what I like a lot of it. I can see some ways in which they connect and ways in which they're sort of separate pieces of a broader discussion. But here's a set of questions I have.
One is, as you know, I've been very worried about sort of the idea of a task force because task force eat up the board. And I'm really, really worried about that. But I will say two things. One, when you talk about it being closer to 5 people than 10 or 15 or 20 people, that makes me feel a lot better. So that's good. One thing that I was sort of playing with in my mind, again, this is all just sort of, we're trying to think this out, is that we have multiple working groups, and each one in its own way wants to work with the different partners, because unless I'd say it a little different than you, but if the partners don't feel like what we're doing is credible, it's going to fall on deaf ears, right? So I want to make sure people are involved in helping us make sure that if it's a survey, the questions we're asking, it seems fair, or if there's a different way of asking it, we ask it that way too, so people feel like it's credible, right? So it might also be that, there's some overlap of those groups. Like if you think of the board as like 5 people, and you think of them more as like advisory, and the other thing you said is not necessarily every month, that maybe there's a group of these partners who are helping us on, consulting, advising on several different things that we're doing. Some of the stuff that's coming out of the well-rounded ed group, some of the stuff that's coming out of the retention group, some of the stuff that's coming out of the research group on high school growth, whatever, social, So that looks like that could be sympathetic to research, keep thinking. So so the other thing I worry about, you raised the money resources, and we'll kick it to John Paul on the staff resources, but I'm very interested in hearing what TNTP thinks can be done with the 50, because the other piece that I'm concerned about is when I talk to some researchers, as I've done, when you get into observations, and we've had this conversation, and you want to have, to use your words, a credible sample, right? 50K doesn't buy you a lot. It can buy you a lot in terms of telephone survey, but it doesn't buy a lot. But that's why I'm interested in sort of hearing what they say. So I'm very interested in hearing that. And to your point, we need to sort of figure out the staff resources. We need to figure out the financial resources. The one other thing that was related was, in terms of who's going to work on it. I guess where I am is, if we're going to put this into a resolution, as opposed to sort of letting things sort of work their way through, I tend to be more on that side. You tend to want it.
Only because it's hard to get people to lean in when it's kind of like, it's kind of an idea, it's kind of something externally people want to know.
Pros and cons. What I worry about though is if we are going to do it that way, we don't yet have sign-offs. We don't yet know really what people are going to do in different organizations, how much they're going to support it. And I will just say, on the task forces, sometimes people participated from different groups and didn't necessarily help with things, implement things. And so I worry about that. I'm worried about making sure that's really happening, and we need to figure out the timing. So I'm worried about a September launch.
I've gotten a verbal commit from folk at the charter board. I'm having a meeting with Hansel on the 13th. I will be sure to update the board with any recommendations or feedback she provides. I've also gotten word of mouth from different people in DCPS that they are open to it. I saw Chancellor Furby this past weekend. I mentioned it to him. He said we should sit down and talk about it. And so as those formal conversations happen, I will be sure to update the board.
Can I just ask a really fundamental question, which is what are you hoping to gain from
concrete data, and that there are systematic.
No, I mean from partnering with these folks. From the test.
Very simply that there's buy-in. To Ruth's point, we can spend a year doing research, and it's a nice, lovely packet that sits and collects dust. Whereas if we have partners there with us, it increases buy-in and credibility. And I don't think we need to increase our credibility, but it will help with buy-in publicly, but also with those agencies, for sure.
So are you considering including school level folks on that test?
I'm open to it. I think we would need to be mindful, because I think that's when things start to get away from us in terms of size. I'm happy with keeping it the major partners, OSSE, Charter Board, DCPS, those types of folk. but I'm open to there being school-based people. Obviously, we would want to keep them informed along the process, and we will be in their schools. So, yeah.
So you're saying that the people who are sitting on this task force, you envision as being the educational leaders of the city versus
Yes.
families?
I mean, there might be a family representative, but
So it's not so much input as like,
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
But that's going to be difficult to
I
formulate.
mean, I don't imagine Hansel herself might sit on the task force.
So I'm saying, you're not saying them, but you're saying somebody from their office.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
I don't think Fairview is going to sit on the
That's
task
what I was
force,
asking.
but yeah.
Okay.
I have to say, I really appreciate the lens you look through where you're working on making sure that we're aligning our work and the funds that we're investing with what we have the authority to do. And as I see something like this helps inform which of the standards we might need to update next, which ones are really working for our students and which aren't, and how we can make sure that the standards that are being taught are really preparing students for. I think there are more than just a knowledge of whether or not standards are being taught at grade level. I think there's a whole nother layer of information we're going to receive about how we can, as a standards approval body, understand better how our standards are being taught and implemented at the school level, at LEA level,
Totally agree.
and statewide. So I really appreciate your alignment there.
And that might be something that we want to put in this, like what we hope to gain from this data.
Similar to the objective.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
not just what we hope to gain, but also how we plan to use it afterwards. So, looking at, because what we hope to gain might be completely different in ways in which we use the data after.
And to Jessica's previous question, I think this dovetails with everything we're doing, including the social studies work. It could, regardless of whatever we find, either people are teaching it or not, I think that data is then going to inform future conversations about our standards as well as the work of other groups.
I think formulating questions would be helpful to kind of help us all see, as Jack pointed out, it's not, I don't think it will just be about grade level.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think the questions that we ask will.
And also, the way I see that is that part of what he's doing is, if you start from the working group, Zach is already adding a question into what you're doing. It's not, right, and then, and from your point of view, we're broadening what you were originally gonna focus on. So with that, let me just refer people, and I don't wanna, now.
I would love to.
Okay.
I would love to hear from John Paul,
Yes.
because that is a question that Fraser, in his absence, did ask me that I wasn't able to speak to.
I think once we have a larger sense of exactly what the task force is going to do, I can answer it more completely.
Fair.
I do think putting something like this together, if it's a smaller group of people, I think that would be potentially easier to put together by September. I would caution that we'd be very specific with our partners or potential partners on what we expect them to give to us, and who we should ask for. Whether that be decision makers, whether that be issue experts, but we need to be clear on what we expect them to provide to us, and then what their type of participation is going to be on the end. I mean, I think that's one of the things that we saw in both the high school grad task force as well as the ESSA task force, that there are often times where the representatives of different agencies participate as much as they can, but aren't able to always sign on to the end recommendations or things like that, because often the recommendations are coming to them, right? So I think I would suggest making it clear on that. For the staff level part, it's going to be intensive, right? There's going to be a lot of staff work here. So if the board decides that this is its priority for its staff, this is what we will focus on, and anything else that the board would want to do, we would have to figure out whether or not that means doing through contractors, doing through other outside outside vendors.
Other things like what?
Well, if we just do any other type of
Yeah, I mean,
if
I
we
think-
continue our teacher
Yeah, no, so I mean, I
retention,
think
we
the
continue-
question is, the question is, there's a bunch of things on the table,
Yeah.
including this. And it's about how much of this can we do? We don't want this to swamp the other stuff, that's the idea.
don't want that.
We don't want that, and so, to some I mean, I think the things that are, I mean, we need to sort of map out the set of things that we have, it's not just the one thing. But I will say, so what I worry about is sort of what you said, which is, if we put forward one, not in the context of others, the effect is to say this should swamp it out, which is sort of how you took it. And I don't think anybody wants that. We want to sort of figure out how we make these work together, conceivably have an advisory or task force that works with a bunch of them.
I think from my point of view, I really appreciated the work that you put into the resolution and the detail that is here. And granted, we may need some more detail in certain areas, but I think if each of the sort of priority areas was this detail, I think we'd be in a much different conversation in terms of staff resources, right? Because we'd be able to see, we have 3 people doing policy and research. So how do we assign 3 people 40 hours a week? And I mean, the actual assigning, of course, is for me, but like the actual understanding of what goes into staffing a task force versus doing a bunch of research on your own, using going into the data and doing those types of things. I think it's possible to do some of these things, looking at our larger group internally. I don't know that it's possible to do all of it. So I don't know how to get there.
It's also timelining it. I mean, it's sort of like
Yeah.
they're not necessarily all.
Are you thinking or anticipating that it would be the staff that collects, codifies the data?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I think if we're talking about 50,000, I think it's going to have to be, right? Like, I don't think there's enough to hire a researcher to do all that. So I think it's going to have to be some of the internal staff. But remember too that the other things that continue to go on for the state, for the staff is, we are going to be having recommendations from the ESSA task force that come out in a couple of weeks. We're going to have recommendations from the Ombudsman and the student advocate that we just heard from today. We have recommendations from the student advisory committee that's going to be coming out in a couple of weeks at our June public meeting. And if we're not kind of just doing happy glad for that type of thing, we need to look at what those recommendations are too and figure out to see how we're doing that. And so if the staff isn't doing that, that type of follow-up, I'm not sure who would be. So that's why I said I'm very hesitant to say, yes, we can do this, or no, we can't do, and by this I mean all of the different groups, until we get a lot more details about what we're talking about. And I think this is a really good step to get the resolution from you and from Ruth to understand that we're all on the same page with all the working groups, right? Because not everyone has participated in all the working groups either. So we want to make sure that when we're voting on the proposals, that this is in line with what we're all talking about.
Well, on that note, pardon me, Zachary, if I might interject, we've already got a roadmap for this, right? Because we've already contracted on a teacher retention, and I want to make sure that we're not setting a higher bar now for this than we did previously for the funds that we spent on teacher retention.
No,
I think that is unfair.
No, I agree. That's why we're trying to process it very much the same in a very similar.
But we have a whole bunch of these working groups that are all operating, which haven't been voted on by the board, and which are spending a lot of staff time and money as well, and have been for months.
Well, let me get to this resolution. Let me just use that as a transition.
And before you, my hope is that this would not monopolize time. I am hopeful, though, that we can consolidate where it makes sense, because I am mindful of staff capacity. And so it has been my perception from the outside looking in that there is a lot of time spent on the working groups, and I'm not sure what's coming out of them or where we're at as a result of them. So I just want to put that out there. If it makes sense to spend so much time there, we're not getting the bang for our buck.
Maybe that's a great way to transition.
Well, that's what. Yeah, so what I want to, so here's what I want to say in the working groups. I mean, I think the point of the working groups has been to have discussions. And this particular discussion happened partly in the working group and partly outside. All of these require a lot of discussion to sort of figure out where people are, what we want to do, what we can accomplish. So, we've discussed, these projects that are, the evolution of these projects in the working group, for a while now, all of which were voted on in terms of the ideas of them were voted on as priorities resolution. So the idea of the working groups was to sort of fashion them into actual projects. So you've been getting reports on that, but now I put them together in this draft resolution on the working group proposals. This comes out of your request at the retreat to do so. So that's what this is, and I try, like I say, I try to sort of push a lot of Zach's stuff in here, to some extent using his words, to some extent not. I assume he and I will continue to go back and forth on that. We'll figure out. I mean, I think it's better if we can make this one thing so it's clear how they're working together. I'm not insisting on that at all. I hope, but I think it raises questions. Anyway, so people should look at this. We're not going to discuss it now. We're already late, but for many reasons, and I don't mean to just keep putting this off. I just think that we have a bunch of sort of resource issues to figure out in terms of what the piece that you're proposing.
That I will be sure you have before our meeting. So in the next week, I will likely send an updated resolution, but also information from those meetings I'm having, as well as the conversation from TNTP.
All right. So we need to start mapping this out, and anyway. So we may want to do it in June. We may want to. I may want to recommend doing it in July, but the point is to keep it moving and starting to getting it on paper and figuring out how these are going to relate. That's
just for the sake of.
I worry about a September launch for all those reasons. That's what I do.
But just for the sake of board capacity, I just would encourage you all, because it is my understanding everyone's not coming. I know I haven't gone to the last few meetings. That I agree that the conversations are valuable. I don't know if it's worth monopolizing staff time, resources, energy for them, respectfully. And so as much as that could be taken off, and we can still have those conversations, that might free up some staff time. Not even just for what I want to do, but just thinking of their time.
Well, I'll just say I do want to again underscore that the working groups were a direct result of the pre-established priorities that the board set at the beginning of the year.
And we agree we could change them.
Yes, and the working groups at this point are coming up with paths forward work plans for the board collectively.
We're in month 6
on addressing those priorities.
We're in month 6 and we have no concrete proposals from any of the working groups. And again,
I'm sorry, that's just not true. That's what all of this is. So
it is my understanding that this proposal is to like a path forward for the working groups versus concrete proposals.
No, it's a set of concrete proposals out of each group, each of which is the result. Yeah, and then with the exception of social studies. Can I say one thing about that, Jessica, before you talk?
Well, okay, that's what I was hoping to say, and make sure that Zachary knew about the fact that we've got a work plan and we've got goals for social studies.
Right. I just want to say, Jessica and I sort of crossed paths on emails. The only reason I didn't include social studies in here, because the first kind of the product, so to speak, of social studies, just given the nature of that work, is a long and very sophisticated planning effort that Jessica has laid out that involves sort of trying to pull together the different partners, including OSSE, to figure out a way to go forward on this social studies thing, which I think is necessary, and there's consensus to do it. I didn't put it in here because it wasn't a product per se. And as I said to Jessica, it was in no way meant to diminish that, and I'm happy to put it in. I was just trying to do the products, not the everything. So, to Jessica.
Well, yeah, so I sent an email to everyone just before my flight took off explaining the standards, the status of the social studies piece. I think this is to me, specifically the resolution and the way in which you're sort of construing it, Ruth, I think is understandable, but also perhaps too narrow given the variety of kinds of work the board is going to pursue as part of these working groups. So the social studies process is not sort of sophisticated and lengthy because I like it that way. I think it's sophisticated and lengthy because it's a really complex process to say we're going to undertake the writing of new state standards. And so it will neatly fit into the same kind of package that a single discrete research project would. And what I want to make sure is just that all of the work that the board is doing is having an opportunity to be consulted and discussed by board members, that we don't get into sort of, and I say this carefully, and I will beg everyone's pardon that it's been a long day, so I don't mean this to sound as snippy as it's going to be, but I do feel there's a little bit of this conversation right now on like, well, I wrote, this proposal was written and other proposals haven't been written, and so this one should take priority. And I hate to see us get to that point right now, because I think all of the work we're doing matters, and I think allocating staff resources is something we should discuss. But I do worry that it need not be the first person to the finish line is the one who gets the resources. Does that make sense?
Totally agree.
Absolutely.
Just to clarify, my apologies if that's how it came off. I'm just thinking I've been in meetings where the meeting could have been an email conversation or a phone call without staff present. And so I just think as much as we can be mindful of that, the better. And the same goes for the work that I'm putting forth, that we just should be mindful of staff capacity. That's all.
And Jessica, I appreciate you circulating the social studies plan. And I'm going to read over that with great interest. There's only one person on this board who's led a standards update, and it's me. So to the degree that I can be helpful to you, please let me know.
I would appreciate that very much, Jack. Thank you.
Because I got the health education standards approved and offered by OSSE with zero input or support from OSSE. So.
Yes, the State Superintendent made that quite clear to me last week when I spoke with her. She shared the work that you all did on those standards from the start and how important that was.
Great, thanks.
So anyway, do you want to say more about the plan, Jessica? Sort of bring people up to date about what's on. What you planning?
Sorry, I was just getting out of my Uber and
I mean, if you can't, up to you.
No, this is good. This board meeting has been on an airplane, in an airport, in an Uber, and now on a stoop in Capitol Hill. So thank you for being flexible with me. So basically the plan is in three parts, and the first part of it is gathering as much information as I can on both the current state of social studies in DC, and that's really in connection with that survey that I shared with all of you and asked if you would share with your network. That is being administered by the group calling itself DC Social Studies, which is a collection of charter school teachers, DC public schools, social studies leadership, coming together trying to understand what's happening and what is not happening with social studies in DC. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is talking to other state boards of education and understanding how they went through the process of updating or writing social studies standards, how long it took, the kind of process they used to deeply engage the public in the process. And sorry, my dog is coming up the stairs to say hello to me. And then understanding too the people who help write standards and what kind of things we might want to be thinking about in terms of the budget and the cost for that. So that's the first part. The second part is understanding who needs to be involved in DC, how we create a task force, how we get buy-in from DCCS and everybody else, and then thinking a little bit about how we would actually construct that process over the next couple of years, getting the right people on a task force, going through writing the standards, and then the third part of it actually in that is what it would look like to draft, have a task force working on it, draft the standards, and then share them for public comment. So what you'll see when you open the plan is an answer that imagines all those things, another tab that looks at some of the questions, I've started making some initial appointments for some interviews and research. And once I present the research to the board, my goal would be to make the task distribution of who on the board is helping with this work much broader than just me. That's the quick overview on that.
Thank you.
Questions?
Jessica, did you get any feedback from OSSE whether or not they are likely to approve this process or standards or not? I know that was a question before.
Yeah, the state superintendent is very much on board with this. Her question was about capacity. And she also asked the question and shared with me, you know, just the experience that she has had in Tennessee with writing standards. Wanted to make sure that the board understood that this would be a multi-year process, that it would be multi-step, that it would require public engagement, and that we understood like the size and scope of what we were taking on. So she is fully on board. She was a social studies teacher. She's particularly interested in seeing the social studies standards updated because they are terribly out of date. She agreed and was excited by the process. I told her I would share with her all the details once the entire board had had a chance to sort of discuss and weigh in, and once we had some initial research to share with her. I told her I thought it felt a little bit underwhelming for her to look at things or consider it seriously before we had some more information to provide to her.
If I can just add two things to this. One is part of what we've talked about is, you know, these standards efforts, and social studies in particular, they are enormous undertakings. As Jessica said, and as Hansel said, you know, think about 3 years. So part of what we have talked about is it has to be staffed. I mean, I do not see this being staffed by the people that are in this room now. We're talking about including it in the budget, whether it goes into the OSSE budget or it goes into the state board budget or it goes into both. That's the way we're looking at this. And so, I mean, is this fair, Jessica, that sort of for the next year we're sort of moving this forward, but the idea would be to get, you know, we'd have staff by a year from October, and that's when it would sort of move into a different phase and a different form in terms of sort of the quantity of work and the lift.
Right, and I think that's right. I also think that we'll have conversations about what the cost would be, but again, there are lots of folks around the country who done this work, and so I think we can learn from them first before we have to think, before we have to have those conversations. All do understand there are budget cycles and implications, but I don't want to put things before the board before we've got some just general research and information.
All right. All right. Okay. So you've got sort of both of these resolutions will continue to be conversation. We're going to try to, the staff is going to try to start mapping out. I mean, they've already started to do this, but sort of how these things lay out next to each other. And I would just say we've got to think of some of this as sequential. I mean, it's not everything at once, but you know how it sequences out. And the one other thing I want to say before moving on is the last part of this resolution talks about sort of then picking up sort of the next part of this. We sort of set a set of priorities, we had a set of conversations, we have a set of products, and now we're moving into the next budget year. And we need to think about the next round, and so we want to talk about that at the July working meeting. Also thinking about, you know, inviting both in July and then again in September the public to come and just sort of say, what are the issues that you think we ought to be looking at? And I say July and September because July is easier for some families because they're not so busy in school, and it's terrible for other families because they're not here. And so if we did it in July and September, I think we could get a good input from people, and it would give us time to also sort of chew on all this. That's all I want to say. We'll keep you posted. All right, next on the agenda, is that anything else you want to say, Zach, before we go to part?
I will share more information in email.
Okay. All right, John Paul.
So in your packets, there's a packet that looks like this. It's a copy of a mayor's order establishing the Community Schools Advisory Committee. So this committee is something I've been serving on behalf of the state board for about 4 years. It's been reconstituted and reorganized to include agency directors as well as some other folks, including the president of the state board or a designee. In order to move this forward, we need to actually have a vote, and so I wanted to bring it to the full board to explain what the committee does, as well as making sure that you're all aware of what the committee is. So originally, this committee was responsible for the Community Schools Initiative grant program that OSSE has run for a number of years. The committee met not only to do best practice type of organizations with the schools who received the grant, but also to evaluate the grant proposals and work on specifics about what the next year's grants might look like, and also to try to assist in connecting with other DC agencies beyond OSSE, DCSB, and DCPS in terms of what was available. So they worked with the Department of Behavioral Health at some points, back when it was actually the Office of Mental Health, as well as other offices. So this new mayor's order, which went into effect in March, like I said, changed the structure of the committee. It was originally largely just sort of volunteers from a number of different places, and one of the places was us as state board, partially because I had personal interest in community schools, and so asked to be part of it. And then Marcus joined for a couple meetings as well, back a little while ago, 2017. Thank you, 2017. I don't remember the specifics. So the new committee is supposed to specifically go beyond what the community service original community schools group did, and present a report on how to broaden and expand community schools in the district. As you know, I think DCPS is already working towards that goal of making every DCPS school a community school. This would also advise them on the current incentive grant program, on whether or not it's working, whether or not it's something that should be a stepping stone to other funding from the government, however, all those types of things that come together. So as you can see on page 2 and 3, the 9 voting government members are joined by 10 public voting members as well. So it's expanding this group by a lot. But one of the 9 official forever and always government members is the president of the state board or the president's designee. So the question that will be before the board in June is who's going to be that person, whether it's going to be the president, whether or not it's going to be one of the other board members, whether you want me to continue with it or not, it's really up to you. But I wanted to make sure that we have that vote in June, because they'd like to impanel the group in July with a full swearing-in ceremony. You have to go through ethics again and the whole bit. It's a lot of fun. One other small thing. I was approached by some folks at OSSE asking if I was selected by the board to be the representative, if I would also be interested in chairing the committee as well. So that would all have to still go through the mayor's office and be approved as chair, but it is a possibility as well to consider. So I wanted to make sure that we were all aware of all of the different things. Any questions on Marcus? Do you want to talk about?
Well, no, I'll just say, I mean, one, I'm grateful that the committee is being reconstituted and really has this broader scope. I think one of John Paul and I's first conversations when I joined the board was about our mutual passion for community schools, and he, I think went out of his way to make sure that I was involved in those conversations early on. I'm excited about the opportunity for one of us to be involved, but also very excited, and I expressed this to both John Paul and I think Ruth inadvertently, that I also be excited about John Paul also having the opportunity to lead this group, especially with the institutional knowledge that he has in the previous iteration of this group, but also his very genuine interest in community schools and community school models and strategy here in the district. And so, if it was my singular recommendation, I would, suggest that the board appoint John Paul to be a representative of the board. But obviously, discussion that's going to be happening and the discussion that will be led. And obviously, I hope that it really results in making sure that we have a deeper commitment to the model citywide, but clearly east of the Anacostia.
I'm glad we're getting back to regular, to your point, regular voting on leadership opportunities. I was just looking at a resolution from January 2018, or a year and a half ago, where we tasked individual board members with responsibilities for attending things, for being our representative to things like the Washington Area Board of Education, which Ruth and Joe were tasked with, and we did a formal vote on that. I really hope that we can get back to that and have everyone vote on who are our official designees to all of these organizations and boards and groups that we're a part of.
Well, I think that's great. So it sounds like I'm a designated interest person here, but if anybody else is interested, let me know. And John Paul, if you could put together a list of these other groups to whom we should have, to whom we should elect representatives.
And I think we've done some already, but we can put the totals together.
It started June 19th. Wow. So we need to vote.
June 19th.
On June 19th.
Got you. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. No, it's we couldn't vote now. No, because we haven't noticed the vote. We only voted in public meeting. Yeah. So this was the next opportunity that we had available for us to vote on it.
So Ruth, I take it you're okay with?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I have more.
Oh, of course.
So the next thing is the proposed budget, which starts looking like this. And I want to thank Serena and Dan for both sticking around too, because their budget is included here. So I really appreciate you sticking throughout the meeting to talk about this too. So the first sheet that you have, that's it. Then you're right. So the first sheet that you have is personnel services. It is broken down by office. It is not broken down by position. Just for my own notification, that I didn't feel like having positions listed would be the best thing. But these are the specific. This is what we would be requesting, or what we're suggesting to request in the FY 2021 budget. This does include the additional funding that was provided by council for the FY 2020 budget for equity. So this already would include that funding, as well as what we've done in the past 2 years, which is provide ability for employees to have merit-based increases as well.
Can you go over very, very quickly
Sure.
what was broken down on what was provided for equity?
Yes.
And where?
Yes. So funding was provided for both the Ombudsman's office and the Student Advocate's office to bring their salaries for their positions below the chiefs, so below the Ombudsman and Student Advocate. If I'm remembering correctly, and I don't remember the specific numbers, but I believe the total was $60,000, 141, I think. And then
just a guess.
Yeah, just a guess. And I believe it was almost evenly split, except for the Student Advocate received $28,000. Is that right? I think that's right, $28,000, and the remainder went to the Ombudsman's office. And then that funding is then split between a number of positions. In the Ombudsman's office, it's split between 3 positions, and in the Student Advocate, it's between 2 positions.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So the next 3 pages is the information related to non-personnel services. And so this is the good stuff, the stuff where we get to spend money on the things that we need. So based on a request from Dr. Kasoy, we did add $15,000 for all 3 offices in each office's budget for translation and interpretation services.
And
yes.
that's only for DC SBOE related hosted events, correct?
So
I
that's
have a concern if members are using it for member-led events, independent of it being an SBOE officially hosted event.
okay.
Well, So does that mean that if somebody has a town hall for their award, then it should be sponsored by the State Board of Ed as well?
Yes, for instance, Education Network Word events should not have a translator. Okay, those are not DC SBOE events. Or, for instance, Zachary's Independent Black Leaders event is not a SBOE hosted event. That should not have takeaway SBOE resources.
I agree, but if a member has an event in their ward,
right,
to talk to their members about a variety of issues, including what's on the state board agenda, and
I think it should be a SBOE hosted event.
What I'm trying to understand is, does SBOE mean not the individual? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Members are having members are having individual events and at their leisure, which they're more than welcome to do. And
No.
what I'm saying is they're hosting events independently that are not necessarily SBOE hosted events that work within the purview of the work that we do, and or not all board members are in agreement of some of the work that other board members are doing. And therefore, I don't think if we allow this we start allowing money independent of SBOE hosted events, it can spread.
So partly this is definitional. Let me just say, we have some time to do this, but I mean, I think there's a definitional question about what is an SBOE sponsored event. In other words, does that just mean someone's going to have a meeting in their ward because they want to raise a bunch of issues, which is their job as a State Board of Ed member? We then agree we will co-sponsor it, therefore it's an SBOE event. Or does it mean something that it?
Well, that's something we need to discuss,
yes,
but at the same time, I mean, we know what SBOE hosted events are. For instance, when we had the ESSA task force events and we held town halls, John Paul and Paul came to those events. Those were hosted and put out by SBOE. When we have Ward 1 or Ward 3, Ed Network, and just because Emily goes to that, or you go to that meeting, that's not an SBOE
No, I agree,
event.
but there's a middle range.
I was going to say the middle ground is that, for instance, if Marcus is hosting a town hall with my constituents, right? And I'm giving them updates on the state board work, right? So what's the distinction, right? If a member of our staff, and we've already talked about staff capacity a lot tonight, but if a member of our staff isn't present in the room, does that mean it's not an SBOE sponsored event? And if they're not, if I want to hold a town hall in my ward, right, that's specifically focused on my work on the SBOE, do I have to come to my colleagues and say, hey, right, I'm going to have Spanish speakers in the room, I need translation services?
That's part of what your stipend is for. Yes, it is.
Well,
that
for
is,
some of us, but
I don't get to pay my bills with that?
No,
that is, it's for your travel to and from events, for you to be hosting events in your ward. That is not a salary.
I think
one of us have the luxury to do more things with the stipend.
I'm just saying that is not a salary, it is a stipend, and that $15,000 is what you should be using that money for. And for us to be pulling money from a pot, that it starts to be a slippery slope.
Can I just say, clearly there's a lot of views on this, it needs to be discussed, nobody wants to be on a slippery slope, but there are different ideas about what is appropriate for state board members to do to make the state board strong. So we need to have that discussion. We're not going to have it tonight, but let's make a note to get it on the agenda in time for it to be resolved and people have the right rules by the time we're dealing with it.
Great. So the other addition that is here is also from our FY 2020 budget is the research funding that we were provided in the FY 2020 budget, I've carried over into the FY 2021 budget as well, as a specific. So the FY 2020 budget included the additional plus up for $130,000 for research.
Yeah.
I've included that as a part of the base for the FY 2021 budget as well. And those are the only changes that I have in the SBOE's budget from what we are currently spending. I did want to make sure, before we do questions, I want to make sure Serena and Dan had a chance to explain anything else that they wanted to do on what they're, I mean, we pretty much all kept the same, so.
So my question is about, do you want to go?
I was just gonna say, understanding that it's the same, but it was my understanding that we hadn't quite met the equity bar for like staff. We have, because of the additional money okay, never mind. Right?
See, we've been doing more than just
I didn't need that. Any offense, I promise.
My question is, about additional staff. So I don't know what, if any, discussions there's been in the other offices. I know for this office, at least one question is about putting in a social studies staffer, someone to handle that. So I don't know where it would go. I mean, I think we need to have some conversations with OSSE, but
For the
Right.
for the
No, I mean,
research?
No, for the social study, if we're gonna revise the social studies
Yeah.
standards, it's a big 3-year thing.
I
It's
see
enormous.
that as a bigger pot, I see.
Well, I just think but that's the question, is do we want it at OSSE, does OSSE want it at OSSE, do we want it here, does OSSE want it here, do we want to divide it? I think that's a real budget question, because there may or may not be an agreement that that person should be at the SBOE, and then it needs to be in this budget, or maybe it should be at OSSE, but it needs to sort of go into effect based on Jessica's planning in this next budget year, in the
Fair
budget
enough.
year that we're talking about.
So let me, I'm hearing bits and pieces of this. Let me make sure I understand. Ruth, it's a question about, we have to decide now about where we want a person to help support this in order to make that budget ask by July?
No, it's that we have to, I'm sort of posing the question, which is when do we have to know in order to make sure that there's something in the budget that produces a staff person in the following budget year, in fall 2020. So I'm really asking, when do we need to know that? Time for July? Is that something we can?
I really don't want us to ask for a staff person that's specific to an individual project, because if we're gonna add capacity, we should add true long-term capacity, not just a 1 year. If we say this person's we need an FTE to work on social studies, there's a very real possibility that we get that for that 1 year, and the next year we would lose that FTE. But if we have an FTE that's focused on standards, implementation, review, updating, etc., I think that's something that we could argue about for
I like
years.
that. I like that idea. So then I think that's then what we could put into the budget. I think that makes a lot of sense.
I also don't want to, I think negate John Paul's ask this past budget cycle around his need for increased capacity around community engagement. And so I don't know where you are on that, but.
Make sure we're talking about Jessica.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jessica, did you hear that?
Community engagement.
Yes, about community engagement money. Yeah, I heard about that.
So, but I think those are all the things we've got to consider if you have it.
Well, the other thing to consider is if we are going to start contracting more than what we have been through the additional research and those sorts of things, we may need to also consider reevaluating our administrative staff and making sure that we have someone on board that has significant contracting experience. We have contracting experience within the agency, but previously it's been pretty limited, right? It's been contracts under $10,000. It hasn't been significant projects, and contract management is a very specific skill set and task, and we don't have that within the agency. So if it's something that we're going to plan to do for the long term, it is something that I'll need to look at changing, fixing, doing something finding additional capacity to make sure that we have it right. Because people go to jail for contracting stuff, and I'm not going to jail.
We don't want you to go to jail. We want you.
Yeah, I'm not going to jail. Yes. So I'm happy to add those as potential enhancements, additional staff people, or if there's additional things. So the process, just to give everyone an idea for the FY 2021 budget, we do need to approve the FY 2021 budget at our July public meeting in order to meet the requirements of the mayor's office for that process. One other thing that has come up in the last week, the Office of the Chief Technology Officer also instituted a new sweep of funds, which we were not informed about. And so they just swept another $15,000 from our budget for the FY19 year. And so I am now in some terse conversations with the Office of the Chief Technology Officer, asking them to explain, one, why they decided, like what authority they swept money from us, as well as understanding what the potential is for FY 2020 and for FY 2021. Because if we need to ask for additional funding to pay for these services that apparently they've been providing that we didn't know anything about, then we need to build it into our budget. And what I explained to them was, you can't come in June of 2019 to ask me for $15,000 of the budget when the year is almost over. Like, I need to know that at a year and a half prior so that we can build it into the budget. So I'm working with them on that process now to figure out exactly what we need and what we are looking for the future. Because it is a long-term process, right? Just like we're talking about here for FY 2021. For instance, if we were to add 3 more people to the agency in FY 2021, I would also need to budget new licenses for email for them, because we're at our capacity, and we need to buy new computers for them, and need to buy new phones for them. It's a much more expensive process than just adding salaries into the chart. So that's what I'm also trying to make sure that we're all aware of, is that we have to plan a year and a half to 2 years in advance for all of the different things that go into them in order to make sure that we don't have to take from other funds.
But all of it goes into enhancements, is that correct?
All of that would go, well, so if it's a functioning thing, right, like we cannot function without it, I would build that into the budget. If it's a new staff person, I have a hard time justifying that is a established foundational need of the agency, other than we really want to expand in this area, right? A new staff person would be an expansion of program, whether that's outreach, whether that's additional capacity for the Office of the Ombudsman and the Student Advocate. It's an enhanced capacity type thing. If we're talking about whether or not we have money to buy a computer, that's, to me, is more a foundational type thing. We have to have that in order for them to do their work, which we've also had in years past that not doing.
And for the July vote, you do or you don't need the enhancement proposal?
We need everything. Everything has to be submitted at the same time. So I'm happy to work with any of the board members on specifics if they have some ideas, and we can look at them at the July working session. Recognizing that the July working session is coming up quickly. It is on July 2nd because of the holiday. So please remember that we do have, so it will be on a Tuesday rather than on a Wednesday this year.
So to what degree is that actually factual? Because we've seen now with this past budget cycle that we've set a precedent that we voted on a budget and enhancements in July of 2018, and we re-voted on enhancements in 2019, and we were still awarded those enhancements. So how much is
not
this?
all of them. I mean, this is part
when we submitted our 2020 budget, there was $0. There was $15,000 in there for research. We re-voted on enhancements in February.
Right. So
to what degree is this real?
There's 2 points in the cycle in which enhancements can really be submitted, right? There's the first section, which is now when they're submitted to the mayor's office. The student advocate was successful in FY19 in receiving additional funds from the mayor's office for that enhancement. The second part is when we go to the council directly after the mayor's already submitted the proposal or prior to the submission of the mayor's proposed budget to ask the council to put additional funds in. So there's two separate entry points for the state board to be part of that. Now, I am going to always defer toward the getting things done on the early side so that we can spend the 6 months, 9 months making sure that all of our council members understand why every single one of our enhancements is an important thing, so that it's much easier to do in the actual process. We're still working, and Jack, as you know, as former president, you know how hard we've been working to make sure that the mayor's office treats our budget appropriately in terms of as a need for appropriations rather than as an agency in which they can cut our budget, which is, from my view, inappropriate and not fully legal, but that's an argument that we're continuing to have with them. And I think by having all of the information up front, it makes it a much more difficult case for them, especially if we've officially voted as an elected body, or you have voted as an elected body. It makes it much harder for them to ignore the fact that we are different than other agencies. Does that explain?
It does. Thank you. And on the mayor's treatment of us and refusing to comply with the budget law in passing along our need for appropriations, is there any sort of advisory opinion you could get out of the Attorney General's office on that?
It's a great question. I'll ask.
And for my colleagues, that's why I voted against the budget enhancement in February, is because we already voted on that year, the 6 months previously. That's the only reason. I wanted to respect the votes of the members that were present and voted for us.
But things change, I'll just say. But anyway, things change, and so.
Yeah, we have elections, but I think that the vote that the votes took when they were here should have meant something. I hope my vote does when I'm done.
Well, I mean, this is a philosophical thing. I think that, we're working very hard to try to make sure that policy products of that group did. I don't know that it's so important. They're not on the board that they are shaping the next week's
Precedents matter in politics. We see what happens when precedents
Can we move forward? Yeah.
I'm done.
Okay, are we done?
We're done.
There's
Any new business? Sorry, guys. I mean, I really wanted to make sure we always have time for new business, but was there anybody that wanted to put anything in new business?
I have a question. I know we talked about board office staff and capacity. What is the process for getting staff support for community-based events? The context. A civic association asked me to join them for a Saturday fair or something. I cannot attend. They then said, well, can you get someone in your office to attend? Obviously, I don't have an office, but I thought maybe, is that something that the staff does?
Call us and ask. Yeah. If we can support, we will try
Can you
to
support this Saturday?
I will not be here.
We'll talk offline.
All right. There's no further business before the state board.
Wait, the new member, the NASB new member institute.
Next week, yes.
Next weekend, with the, who
Are
are the new
you
members?
chairing one of the tables this week?
Yeah, they asked me to work with mine.
President Flag, son going to this.
Yeah.
Well, no, they asked me to come on the board.
Oh, this is a different thing. You'll
Oh, it
see.
is?
Go, if you can go.
Yeah.
It's well worth it.
Yes.
You learn a lot. You meet a lot of people.
19,
14 and 15.
14.
With no further business before the state board, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Ayes have it. This wording section of the state board is adjourned.
You didn't ask for the